This is Julian Pleasance, and I'm with Judge Joseph W. Hatchett, and we are in Tallahassee, Florida. It's August the 10th, 2006. Would you tell me when and where you were born?
I was born in Clearwater, Florida in September of 1932.
And tell me a little bit about your early life and something about your parents and what they did.
Well, life in Clearwater, Florida was like life everywhere else in the South at that time. My father was a laborer, spent most of his time doing citrus work. My mother was a maid, and his name was John Hatchett, her name was Lula G. Hatchett, and they had together 10 children. I was the last child, so I'm the baby of the family, and being born in 1932.
Is it difficult being the 10th in a bunch of brothers and sisters?
No, I came along so late that I was not in the household with ever more than 2 of my siblings because there was a 7-year gap between the last birth and mine. So I had that 7-year gap brother with me, but the others had gone off to military and to other pursuits.
Talk a little bit about what your interests were as a young man and a little bit about your schooling.
Well, aside from schooling, it was music. My mother insisted that I learn to play a piano. I hated every minute of it, but Mommy said do it, and Daddy, the enforcer, said you'd better do it. So I started off very early in life playing piano. Most of my sisters and brothers also played music at the command of Mother, of course. I attended public schools all through high school, elementary, all the way through high school, and in a completely segregated society, especially. And played sports, played basketball, varsity, played a lot of softball. At that time, Clearwater had the Clearwater Bombers, the world champion softball players. So everyone in Clearwater played softball. I was never good enough to make the varsity softball team, but I did play basketball. Then later in high school, I took my music on to the playing of trombone, and that was in an organized band, and I did that for about 5 years in the later years of high school. So other than that, well, I was in the Boy Scouts, active in the church. Both of my parents were active in the church. So I played piano in Sunday school after learning how to play well enough to do that. And that was about the childhood that I had.
What was your attitude toward the rather insufficient quality of the segregated school system? Secondhand books, teachers were not as well qualified, not enough money, separate but equal, but of course they were not equal. Did you feel like that this was oppressive in any way or held you back?
Yes, well, no question about it. For example, I attended a high school that did not have chemistry, did not have a chemistry lab. Consequently, anyone finishing from that high school would be deficient in anything scientific, especially in chemistry. When I was in elementary school, of course, I was too young to worry about those things. Segregation was the law of the state at the time. My mother and father were not the kind who would buck the law or break the law. So I didn't hear very much discussion about how bad things were when I was young. It was after I got into junior high school that I realized the unfairness in the segregated system and started really worrying about it. And it's a result of that kind of worry that sent me off to law school. My civics teacher, never will forget, told us one day that the United States and the South was going to be changed by the law, and that direct action would not work, and that we therefore needed to train ourselves to be social engineers. And the best way to do that was to pursue a life in law. And I believed that, and I decided then that I wanted to go to law school. and really became interested in the struggle for freedom in America as a result of that lecture that he gave us.
Was one of your early heroes Thurgood Marshall?
Yes, very much so. I, of course, attended law school at Howard University, the same law school that Thurgood Marshall attended. And while I was there, I had the opportunity to see him from time to time. Of course, I was a young law student. I dared not go up and try to talk with him because he was then the general counsel of the NAACP. And he would come to the law school and practice the arguments that he was going to make before the Supreme Court. As you may recall, most of the professors at Howard Law School were the attorneys for the people in the Brown case. So I was right there with Thurgood Marshall and with all of the people who were making a change in America, trying to get the court to adopt their ruling in Brown versus the board. So yes, he became an early hero, but of course he was bigger than God around there at that time. He argued, I forgot how many cases, 20 or 30 cases before the Supreme Court, and here we were, little law students trying to understand things like equity. And to see this giant walking around the halls was quite inspirational.
Of course, he became an even bigger giant later when he was on the court.
That's exactly right.
While we're on that, you graduated the same year as Brown won, 1954.
From Florida A&M.
From Florida A&M.
Yes.
Talk a little bit about your reaction to that case at that time and how you think it impacted both you, A&M, and the state of Florida.
Well, at Florida A&M, I was a political science major. And so we had been watching that case. Our professors had been discussing it. We knew it was pending. And I realized very early that if the Supreme Court came out the way I wanted, it was going to make a big change in America. And of course it did. And it came out just 2 weeks before my graduation from Florida A&M, which boosted again my desire to go on to law school. Of course, I couldn't right then because there was something called a draft at that point, and I'd been deferred because I was in the Reserve Officers Training Corps. So I had to put in 2 years in the Army, mandatory 2 years in the Army, which I did. But as soon as I could get out, my 2-year obligation, I then rushed right to Howard Law School, where all of that action had taken place and where the planning for the Brown case had taken place. It's probably the greatest change in America, certainly the greatest change ever brought about by a court opinion, I think. The effects of it are still being felt. It was a difficult case, I think, for the court. It took many years to make it work. While we were discussing that, I might mention that I was first appointed to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, and I was appointed in 1979, and that court still had school systems under supervision. So I got to hear at least half of the cases in Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Texas that rolled out of the Brown ruling. So I lived long enough and got appointed to the bench and had a direct impact on implementing the Brown case.
What did you think of Brown 2, where in this case they put it back with the local schools, but the federal courts would oversee that, and they gave this sort of vague term with all deliberate speed. Did you think that that was going to create some legal problems down the line?
No, I didn't right then. When the opinion came out, of course, I had not been, the Brown 2 came out, I had not completed law school. And I didn't know what was going to take place. I was naive enough to believe that the school systems would simply follow the Supreme Court's opinion. Well, of course, that did not happen. And all deliberate speed turned out to be almost 20 years. And I got into that very early, too. I finished law school, came to Daytona Beach, and of course the schools were being desegregated at that time. We were now in 1959. And while the schools were being desegregated, there were all kinds of plans. You could switch from a school if your race was in the minority. Then in some places there were school attendance zone plans. But there were myriads and myriads of plans all through the South. And so I spent much of my time in Daytona Beach appearing before the Volusia County School Board, trying to get African-American kids entry into what had all been all-white elementary schools and high schools. And so the problem was the system would change about every 2 years, but it kept me busy as a young lawyer.
Well, when we go back to Brown too, it's the opposition is rather virulent. Virginia closes its schools. Mississippi makes a white-only public school. You would have seen that kind of opposition all the way past 1959, would you not?
Oh, absolutely. Oh, yes. Even when I got on the court in 1979, every now and then we would still get those problems. And it continued too because of geography. For example, in a Georgia county outside of Atlanta, whites moved north into the county while blacks came out of Atlanta and occupied the southern portion and reestablished segregated schools without any force of law, just by movement of people. And our panel ruled busing and asked them to bus the students around. I've never received so many letters from parents, black and white, who were protesting our ruling. Because as late as in the 80s, that kind of a struggle was still going on as to what's the proper remedy for a segregated school. Not only it was pretty easy when it was by law, it became far more difficult when it was by migration, by changes in housing patterns. So we were still struggling with the Brown effects as late as the 80s.
Well, and now we are gone almost back to where we started because some inner cities are 95% African American, and it's hard to say that any school board is discriminatory because it would be hard to rearrange geographical patterns.
Right.
You can't move whole families and that sort of thing, and busing is pretty much, I think, not accepted anymore.
No, that's the point I was trying to make, that it was, our opinion was very, very unpopular among the black plaintiffs once we said that to cure this, we would have to have busing. The other reason, the other change is that black parents don't care anymore. Desegregation for the sake of desegregation is just not an idea or pattern that black people want to file lawsuits over. There are a lot of reasons for that. Number one, there's representation on school boards, and so the fairness is greater, and the opportunity to be heard and to get relief is greater. The other thing is people who were formerly plaintiffs are now active voters, and so the pattern of the constituency has changed even for all school board members. Consequently, there's more fairness that can be afforded because there's more diversity in your school boards. But in terms of let's just desegregate a school, black parents don't care about that anymore.
Let me ask you about your choice for an undergraduate institution. Obviously, at this time, University of Florida was segregated. Did you ever think about challenging the segregation at the University of Florida?
No, I did not. I was not interested in going to University of Florida. I wanted to go to Florida A&M University. I had two, a brother and a sister, who attended that institution. Florida A&M University had the finest band in the world. And
still do, as far as I know.
As far as I knew too. And I wanted to play in that band. And of course I did come to Tallahassee and I asked for a music scholarship. I will never know whether I was going to get it or not because Dr. Foster, who's still here and is alive, I asked him about it all the time. He says, well, I was thinking about it. What happened was I got another scholarship, an academic scholarship, so I couldn't have two from the same institution. So I never did find out whether I would have gotten a music scholarship, but I did play in the band for 4 years.
Your major was political science. You've already indicated you got really interested in the law. Did you ever think about being a judge, or you just thought you would like to practice law?
Oh, I never dreamed of being a judge. Not only back then, but when I attended law school, I never believed I would see a black judge in the South. No, no, no. It would have been foolish back in the 50s when I was in high school to think of a black judge. My imagination couldn't have run that wild. And as I said, even in law school, I didn't think so. It was only after 1959 when, well, I can remember when the first black judge, circuit judge, was appointed. It was appointed by Governor Reuben Askew in Fort Lauderdale. And this was way up in the 70s. So no, America's changed far faster than I ever thought it would in terms of race relations.
Talk a little bit about your service. You were in the Army for 2 years.
Yes.
Where did you go and what kind of duty did you have?
I entered the service immediately after college. As I said earlier, required to do so because I'd been given a deferment in order to become an Army officer and then to serve 2 years and 6 years in the reserves. I was stationed in West Germany. Of course, there were 2 Germanys at that time. I was in West Germany. I was an anti-aircraft artillery officer and spent 18 months in Germany doing that. Of course, the other months were in training. And then I was discharged.
You were at Fort Bliss? Where did you train?
Fort Bliss, Texas, yes. Mm-hmm. At the Guided Missile School, anti-aircraft and guided missile school at Fort Bliss, and then straight to West Germany. I served in many different, of course, at first I was simply a platoon leader, and then I became a communications officer. It was black officers in the Army in those days quickly became staff people rather than command people. So I spent 3 or 4 months as a line officer, and then from then on I went to staff positions so that I was not in direct command.
And of course, Truman had integrated the armed services in 1948, but by the time you were in there, there had not been a tremendous amount of change in terms of what you were talking about, where African Americans would be platoon leaders with all mixed troops.
That's right. In fact, I have an interesting story about that. Yes, you're right. That was in 1948 by a presidential proclamation that the armed services were desegregated. Well, as I said earlier, I reported into Fort Bliss, Texas in 1954. There were a busload of us from Florida A&M, about 30, from Hampton University, another black university, there were 30 or 40, and from Howard University, there were a busload of 60 or 70. In spite of the fact that these buses came in at different times over a 24-hour period, we soon realized that all of the black officers had black roommates. And the way the rooms were set up, there was a bedroom, and then a bath. And we were all paired. All of the black lieutenants were paired. So we complained about it and got relief. Relief like no one else in the Army has ever gotten. All of the black second lieutenants ended up with private quarters. Each one had their own bedroom and their own bath. Rather than putting us together or mixing us with the white lieutenants, they just simply gave all of us.
That's pretty good to have your private room in the Army.
A private room is a second lieutenant with a private bath. No one had ever heard of such a thing.
You're lucky to have a latrine you can use with
That's right.
25 other people.
That's right.
Now, how did this military service impact you personally and affect your career?
Well, personally, as I said, I went to officers training school at Fort Bliss as a second lieutenant. So I had 4 years in college and 6 months of training on leadership. That was the first thing. If you're in the military, you learn discipline. You learn respect for authority. And so because I started as a freshman at FAMU in military pursuits, I think it helped me in at least those 3 areas: leadership, respect for authority, and discipline. Not to mention a good feel about yourself, having learned to command men and expect them to do what you say. For example, what we call military presence, where you tell them take the heel whether your knees are shaking or not. And I did enjoy the military, and after law school, I then went into the Marine Corps Reserves as a lawyer, as a staff judge advocate officer, and enjoyed that, and I retired in 1988 from the Marine Corps Reserves.
Of course, you were in Berlin at the height of the Cold War.
No, I was not.
You were in West Germany.
West Germany.
Yeah, you didn't get to Berlin at
No.
all? No.
No.
But still, the Cold War, when the time you were in the service,
That's right.
was at its peak.
Absolutely.
Did you have any relationships at all with the Russians, or any experience that related to the Cold War?
Oh, yes. We would have what we call Seventh Army alerts. That's the headquarters, the umbrella branch of service that I was in, 7th Army. And we would have alerts. We would have one every month. Those were training. And then there would be real alerts. The problem is we never knew the difference. But I do recall one time that we did not go out to our regular place. We got the alert and we were told to go to a different place. And we all assumed then it was because of movement on the other side of the line in East Germany. And we didn't just concern it. That was the reason that we were shifted, because we were reinforcing another group that thought they may have an attack. And of course, in Germany, our job, my platoon's job, was to protect the bridge, which was quite important because we had forces on the eastern side of the Rhine River. And so we would have to hold those bridges for those folks to get back, very much like World War II, when the bridges were so important. And so I had a good experience in the military and enjoyed it.
How did you get along with the German population? Did you have much interaction with them?
Very much so. Had no problem with them at all. We were conquerors when I got there. We were still occupation forces. And of course, they were not allowed to have an army at that time. But I had no problem with the German population at all. I was down in Karlsruhe, Germany, which is a southern area where there's a lot of farming taking place. And so the only intermingling was in the village square in these small villages, and often we were training in their areas. But no, I found them cordial, not beating themselves over the head to be nice, but normal. After all, we were conquerors at that time.
And we've talked about law school. Why in particular did you choose Howard?
Because it was the civil rights law school of the time. And I knew that in studying about which law schools to go to. So I was dead bent on getting out of the Army and going straight to Howard Law School. I didn't think of going anyplace else.
Did you think at all, again, about trying to get University of Florida?
No. No, I just didn't have the heart to be fighting about anything at that point. I wanted to get my education, get my law degree, and then come out and fight.
What professors influenced you in law school?
Oh, gee. Jim Nabrett. He ended up being dean of the law school and president of the whole university. Jimmy Washington, a very, very bright teacher who taught real property law, and a contracts professor whose name was Swartz. Impressed me because of their knowledge of the law, their ability to teach it. I wasn't so much interested in the contracts, but I thought he was an excellent teacher, and I thought, boy, I want to learn the law and the control and to line up cases that way and to understand what courts are doing that way. Those were the three, I think, that were top.
And constitutional law would have always been an interest of yours?
Yes, I was very much interested in constitutional law. I didn't particularly like the professor, but I knew that was an important subject, especially if I were going to come back and do civil rights work. I knew I had to learn constitutional law.
Now, when you graduated, you came back to Florida to take the bar exam.
Yes.
And the bar exam, as I understand it, was given in Miami at the DuPont Hotel, but the DuPont Hotel segregated.
Yes.
So explain what you had to go through to take the bar in the state of Florida.
Well, as you said, it was segregated, but remember every other hotel was segregated also. That was the law of Florida at the time. But we were not told. I don't know why I assumed that I'd go to a bar exam and segregation would not raise its head. But we were told at lunch, all of the black members, they called off the names. They said, all of you meet with so-and-so when we break here. And so we did. And the director, who was then with the Florida Bar here in Tallahassee, told us that we could not be served in the lunchroom, in the main dining room.
And this is 1959, right?
Yes. But if we desired, we could go to the mezzanine, and they would set up tables there, and we would be served. We said, no thanks, and went down the street and got a sandwich. It was 3 days long, so that happened for 3 straight days. And that was all there was to it. I guess what was so bad, there were other places the Florida Bar could have scheduled. They could have scheduled it in the basement of a church. They could have scheduled it a lot of places, because instead of having thousands of people taking the exam back in 1959, 50 or 60 people taking a bar exam, and they could have even scheduled it here at their home.
How many African American were taking the exam then?
4.
In fact, I think I've read somewhere in the 1960s, there was something like only 25 African American lawyers in the whole state. Does that sound right?
Oh, no, in 1959, when I passed the bar, there were only 25 black lawyers in the state of Florida. And we knew each other because most of us had been to Howard University. But on taking that exam, there were 4 of us, which included Justice Leander Shaw, who's just retired from the Florida Supreme Court. He was one of those 4. The 3rd person is dead, and I've lost count of the 4th one who took the bar.
Well, it was a pretty good group taking the bar.
Yes, yes, we did very well.
What was your reaction to the bar at that time? I've heard other people tell me that it was much more difficult then than it is now, and there was a very high percentage of people who took it who did not pass it.
That's true. That is, yes, there were a large number of people who took the bar exam and did not pass it, especially the few African Americans who were taking it at that time. I didn't like the Florida bar. When I began practicing, the Florida bar was totally against desegregation and even prosecuted some lawyers from down in Miami who were taking on civil rights cases. Now, they didn't call it that you're taking on civil rights cases, of course. It was called solicitation. It was called all kinds of things. But several lawyers were punished by the Florida bar for their civil rights activities. And I do mean now white lawyers who dared to take on these cases.
While we're on that, I want to ask you about a very important case I know you know about, Virgil Hawkins versus the Board of Control.
Yes.
And this is a case that went on for 9 years. He tried to get in the University of Florida Law School, and the Florida Supreme Court consistently either put him off when he tried to get to the United States Supreme Court. They wouldn't accept the case. And I know you had a very strong reaction to the arguments by the Supreme Court in this case. If I may give a brief thing that I know a little bit about, they had sent Judge Murphy to sort of get a fact-finding tour, and he came back and said, well, if he's admitted to law school, students will drop out, there'll be violence and all this sort of thing, and it simply is going to be unacceptable for him to go to the law school. And it's pretty clear that that was a rationalization to keep him out of the law school. What was your reaction to all of this 9-year attempt on the part of Virgil Hawkins to get accepted?
Well, that's my case. I lived through all of that. When I finished law school, I first practiced with a lawyer named Horace Hill in Daytona Beach. Virgil Hawkins had actually been on the staff at Bethune-Cookman College in Daytona Beach. Horace Hill had brought that lawsuit. I went to work for Mr. Hill, and in the corner of a room, boxes and boxes of papers, and in those boxes were all of the documents and pleadings in the Hawkins case. And Virgil Hawkins I met. He would come by to see Mr. Hill. And of course, this is 59. It's about over at that time. Then we go fast forward, and I was on the Florida Supreme Court. And the Virgil Hawkins case came back to the court while I was there. So that caused me to have to study the record in that case from all of that period that you were talking about, and to get up to date on the second petition for Virgil Hawkins.
Now, was this his attempt to be admitted to the practice of law?
Yes.
After all of these years?
Yes, and it was because, well, he petitioned to be admitted to the practice of law, although he had not finished an accredited law school. And
Yeah, he went to the University of New England.
Right.
It was accredited after he graduated.
That's right. It was a non-accredited law school. And in spite of the fact that he had never taken the Florida bar and passed it, he still wanted the right to practice law. Well, lo and behold, a very, very smart lawyer had represented him. And that lawyer found out that there was one other lawyer in the state who had not finished an accredited law school, but had been admitted to practice law. And he cited that case to us as I sat on the Supreme Court.
This is Ben Irvin, who had flunked the bar 4 times. And he was still, because his brother or his uncle or something was Attorney General, I think.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. And that was the only precedent on the books. But the court had said in that case, if I remember correctly, that but for the fact that he went off to save his country, because he went off to do military service, but for the fact that he had gone off to save his country, he would have completed law school. And at that time, the University of Florida Law School did not require you didn't have to pass the bar. He would have been enrolled as a lawyer. And so this lawyer asked the court, why doesn't this apply to Virgil Hawkins after all? But for the unconstitutional actions of the Florida Supreme Court, he would have practiced law, and he would have been waived in as anyone else. Well, we struggled with that case and struggled with it. Of course, as you know, we ordered his immediate admission to the Florida bar, and he practiced after that.
Of course, by then he was probably 70 years old.
He was 70 years old.
I heard or read at one point that some members of the Supreme Court, Florida Supreme Court, and here I would say B.K. Roberts would be one of them, were willing to let him take the bar exam rather than admit him to practice. Were you aware of that sort of option considered by the court?
You've asked me something that I can't comment on.
Okay.
Because, of course, I was in all of those conferences, and I have to leave it to what the court said in writing. And all it said in writing was immediately admit him to the Florida bar.
Well, I do know that you wrote a rather blistering dissent about all of that, and I think if I can quote you, I believe this is correct, you denounce the injustice members of this court once willfully wrought with their lawlessness on the part of men sworn to uphold the law. And that was just part of a rather strong dissent about not only previous court decisions, but literally the time it took for the court to finally recognize his rights.
If you look on the record, you won't find a dissent. There is no dissent in the Hawkins case.
Where did that come from?
Someone at the court must have said so, but there is no dissent in the Hawkins case.
Well, you withdrew your dissent. Is that correct?
All I can tell you,
Okay.
there is no dissent in the Hawkins case. If you go and pull the case, there is no dissent.
Okay.
There are a lot of things that happen inside.
I understand. I've done.
There are drafts of all kinds of things.
Okay.
And
Well,
the official case says he's immediately admitted.
on a personal level,
Yeah.
I think from most legal scholars, this was outrageous, and even at a time when the United States Supreme Court, and you had Sweat v. Painter, there were all kinds of decisions that set precedent that if there were not a graduate school available, that they had to be allowed in. And these cases were clear cut, and the Florida Supreme Court previously said, how dare the Supreme Court tell us what to do? You know, we determine our own system here. And
It was absolutely outrageous, and I don't think it's been matched in the law in this country where a state court has addressed an opinion of the United States Supreme Court in the manner that the Florida Supreme Court did so in the Hawkins case. I hasten to add, however, that the Florida Supreme Court within the last 3 years has publicly apologized for the conduct of that court at that time. Yes, in fact, in one of the opinions, the writing justice says, we can find as many ways to keep Hawkins out of the University of Florida as you can find to put him in.
well, in fact, one point they changed the score necessary to pass the bar exam so he wouldn't be admitted on that basis.
Exactly.
I mean, it was willful attempt to prevent him from coming.
Oh, no question about it. And you just read the opinions, and
Oh, yeah,
they were not hiding it.
No.
There was no attempt to hide what they were doing. And as I said, it's just absolutely unequaled for anything like that in American law. You can't find a case as outrageous as that. And I commend the present court for publicly apologizing for that. It was a great, great injustice.
In May 2001, they apologized for what they called, I think, a great or grave mistake.
Yes.
And then one thing I don't know if you're aware of, about 3 or 4 years ago, the University of Florida, with a unanimous vote by the faculty, gave him a posthumous degree.
Yes,
which I thought was belated, but
right.
better to correct it than not correct it at all.
Yes, I'm aware of that.
We have an interview with Steve O'Connell, and in justifying his decision, he keeps going back to the two major issues. This is a states' rights issue, and the federal government doesn't have any business interfering with the educational system of the state of Florida. But the basic concept that we hear about over and over again, it would cause great turmoil, and that the people would be angry and upset, and there would be all this violence. And there was absolutely no proof that that would in fact have been the case.
That was just made up. Just the report was probably written before the judge ever left Tallahassee. No.
Now let's talk about your first years as an attorney. You were at Daytona Beach. You talked a little bit about practicing with the Volusia County School Board. What other kind of law did you practice?
Oh, civil rights.
Always civil rights?
Yes. No, not only, but a lot of that. For example, I got in into the practice just in time for the sit-ins, demonstrations at lunch counters. And so I was very busy in St. Augustine, Melbourne, Daytona Beach, Cocoa, all the way down the East Coast, in the surrounding area of Daytona Beach, defending sit-ins. And I tell some people I lost more cases in one day than many lawyers try in a lifetime. Because I'd have sit-ins who'd been arrested in St. Augustine, and I'd go up there to the trial. Of course, they put on one officer who said what happened. I'd put on one of the protesters who said what happened. And of course, we'd stipulate that the same thing happened as to all the other 30 or 40, and so all of them would be found guilty. And then in the afternoon, I'd be in Daytona Beach and do the same thing and lose all of those cases. But the whole idea, of course, was to get the constitutional arguments before
Get on the books, yeah.
and make the court rule on them. And of course, the problem that we had was there was no way. I finally found out there was no way to get the Florida Supreme Court to take the case once I had the ruling I wanted. They simply would deny jurisdiction, which made it almost impossible to get the case to the United States Supreme Court where we were trying to go. At that time, I was a cooperating attorney with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. So we had picked issues that we were going to press all through the South and hopefully get them to the United States Supreme Court. And of course, finally a Virginia case got to the court. And I think the other one was one from South Carolina. And because there was interstate commerce cases, bus station cases.
Were you involved in the '63 St. Augustine riot with the Klan and Hoss Minucci and all of those people?
I was right in the middle of all of that. That was probably, I did more work in St. Augustine than any place else. And I think the strangest thing that happened there was on one occasion when black protesters went into the Atlantic Ocean, and the Florida Highway Patrolman waded into the ocean in full uniform to take them out of the Atlantic Ocean. That went across the world, and of course that helped break the back of the resistance to segregation because it was just so outrageous. It was just ridiculous. I could hardly believe it myself. Then in St. Augustine, there were times.
Excuse me, Judge, it's a little hard to understand how you can make some sort of parameters in the ocean.
Yes.
It's a little difficult to know
Yes.
where you cross the line under those conditions.
Exactly. Oh, and why?
And why?
Why would you want to do
Even more
such a
so,
thing
why?
as that? And then the other incident is the one that's always talked about, and that's the Motel owner pouring acid into the swimming pool. I was not there when that happened, but that's the kind of thing that made St. Augustine special in breaking down segregation in the South. Those pictures went around the world. They went into the White House. They went into every congressman, and it was just so ridiculous. The extent
It went so far.
it was going so far.
Yeah.
Someone had to do something, and the Congress looked at it, and we were in the Cold War at the time, and we were looking awfully bad as a nation. And then Mrs. Peabody, the governor's mother, came to
Endicott
St.
Peabody,
Augustine.
yeah.
And that heightened St. Augustine. And of course, finally, Dr. Martin Luther King came and of course brought the whole world press with him. And with that kind of pressure, it meant that something had to give. The Congress and the president had to get involved. And so we got acts passed, and we got the Civil Rights Act passed, and got beyond that.
I think this and Birmingham and all of that had a huge impact on forcing, for the first time, the Congress of the United States to deal with this issue.
Absolutely.
Somewhat reluctantly, and we give some credit to Lyndon Johnson for changing his views. Took a while.
Yes.
It was the Monson Lodge, wasn't it, where they...
That's it. Yes, it was.
Where they did.
Monson Lodge, that's right.
And it's interesting to know, I interviewed the governor about this, and he deliberately sent the highway patrol and some National Guard, and his argument was he was maintaining the peace. But it's very clear from their actions what they were doing. They were trying to prevent integration.
Absolutely. Oh, no question about it.
What was your impression of Dr. King at this time?
He was just another civil rights leader. No one had any idea that this was going to blossom into worldwide attention for Dr. King. There were lots of things going on around the country, all through the South. Dr. King, the NAACP had been the main organization working for desegregation. And so Dr. King was, number one, head of a brand new organization that no one knew very much about.
This SCLC?
SCLC, and
Excuse me, Southern Christian Leadership Conference.
yes,
Right.
we may have said that the letter's wrong, but Southern Christian Leadership Conference, that's right. And there was another one, that was SNCC, I think that we just said, but yes. But he was new on the block, and most of us were tied to the NAACP by Law School Association and by sit-ins, and believing again that you change all of this by law and not by direct action. The NAACP was not a direct action institution. It was bring a lawsuit and persuade the good people of the city to do the right thing. And then suddenly, here comes someone with direct action, which was brand new to everyone. And it took a little while for everyone to get on board, especially the parents of the black children. The children were in jail, and consequently they had to sooner or later come to mass meetings, give money, get them out of jail, and try and get involved in this. Other than that, I don't know that Dr. King would have been successful in a direct action that was so new to America, the way we do business. Only in labor situations did you use direct action and picketing and that type of thing. So it was a new thing. Of course, after he came to St. Augustine and started rising in stature, of course, everyone then knew he was a great figure and would be remembered as such. But early on, didn't think very much.
Although he had been very persuasive in Montgomery.
Yes.
And sort of had built up some support. And we see in Birmingham, you mentioned the children, the Children's Day, right. In some ways, what King called creative tension. He did it in a peaceful way, right. But he had hoped to have the oppressors demonstrate their cruelty. That's what happened on national TV in Birmingham, and that may have tipped the balance in America.
Yes, and Dr. King has been given credit for knowing where to take the action. It was always involved in a city involving poor law enforcement. Had the law enforcement acted properly, there may not have been success as quickly. But again, it's that tension and the battle and the uncertainty and the danger that everyone in the town feels when there's tension like that, that gets attention and gets attention nationally. Yes, the water hoses in Birmingham and beating people out of the ocean in St. Augustine, and bull whips and cattle prods in the Selma situation. That's what went across the world. That's what went into the White House. It went into the homes of congressmen and senators and made a difference. It just couldn't stand the pressure anymore.
And that's the reason he picked Selma, because of yes. Jim Clark.
Exactly.
He almost knew
yes.
that under these conditions that Jim Clark would overreact.
Oh yes. Everywhere he was very successful, it was bad to law enforcement. For example, we had demonstrations in Daytona Beach. Daytona Beach was a fairly liberal city, even though it was a segregated city. It was liberal because, number one, Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune had great influence there. Bethune-Cookman College at the time was the largest employer in the county, and and of course, Mrs. Roosevelt, the president's wife, would come and sit on the porch with Mrs. Bethune. So all of that helped Bethune-Cookman and Bethune and Daytona Beach seem a little different from other cities. That was good, except when it was time to get demonstrators on the streets, it was hard to do so because the college kids were finding nothing to do but walk around in the front of the grocery store or dime store. That doesn't interest the kids. When it's a little shabby, when there's a little pushing, when there are few arrests, you could go out to the college and get 50 demonstrators. But if they do it for 3 days and law enforcement not do anything except what was proper, you'd have a hard time getting 10 the next day. So Dr. King was very good at choosing where law enforcement would act in a way that would advance his cause.
It's like Albany, when they did not react with violence and just put them in jail, and that
yes.
sort of died out.
Right.
I remember talking to John Lewis and telling me about Edmund Pettus Bridge and
right.
the troopers coming with horses, and
right.
as you know, he had his skull fractured,
yes.
and he was talking to somebody with him on that bridge. He said, "Can you swim?" I said, "No." So we're in big trouble now.
Yeah.
But part of it too, I think, is the courage demonstrated by all these people who
yes.
refused to fight back,
right.
who were willing to be beaten, who were willing to be burned with cigars sitting at the Woolworth counter in Greensboro, on and on and on. I think the American public saw that
sure.
and said, here's an example of people who are just fighting for their rights, and they're really willing to sacrifice to get the rights that should have already been given to them.
Absolutely. And the right and the wrong was so very clear back in those days. I mean, what was happening to African Americans in the South and to some extent all over the United States was just wrong. It didn't take a genius or anyone to know what is happening is wrong. That's getting more difficult now as we move into things like economic advancement, where an African American, for example, now to qualify for a certain thing must show individual ability and individual criteria, individual accomplishments to get it. Back in the early civil rights days in the 60s, what was wrong, and it was wrong to everybody that was suffering. And when people ask me what has changed, the kind of things that we're seeking now, that African Americans are seeking now, have to do with individual qualifications. And simply being a member of the group doesn't qualify anymore. And so it's getting harder and harder to sell the case for advancing, such as affirmative action. Those arguments get harder and harder to make. But it was so easy to say everyone should be able to sit down and get a hamburger, especially if you've been wounded in combat taking care of this country. And that happened to me. I came back from Germany into a segregated America, where my proper seat on the bus was the back row. And I'd been in Europe helping keep down the red tide from sweeping across Europe. And yet, when I got back here, it was still a segregated society. And of course, I haven't mentioned it, but of course, when I started practicing law, everything was still segregated. We were making headway. But I walked into courtrooms, of course, that were completely segregated. Defendants in the D-Land courthouse, a black person did not sit on the first floor with the counsel unless they were on trial, unless it was their own case. If they came to see a relative in court, they sat in the mezzanine. And the courthouses were completely segregated in terms of facilities and everything else.
Was there, in a court case, did you get a fair hearing from the court? Was there justice prevailing in the cases you brought before the court?
No. I went into court knowing if I had, for example, a white party on the other side, that the judge was going to do everything they could possibly think of for me to lose and for my client to lose. And I'm just talking about in regular landlord-tenant, regular types of litigation. Now, when you came down to civil rights cases, I've had judges turn their back, wouldn't even listen to me. I mean, turn their back, wouldn't look at me while I addressed the court. And, but that was expected. I didn't come back to Florida from law school expecting things to be fair. That's why I went to law school, because I knew they weren't fair. We had to change that. That was our mission. Everybody that left that school. And so you made your argument no matter what the judge did, and then you take your appeal. So no, it was not fair.
I was interested, you mentioned Daytona Beach, and I always think about when Jackie Robinson first came to play ball there, you know,
Yes.
it was segregated. Right. And when he was in the Army, he was a lieutenant.
Right.
And he was forced on one occasion to sit in the back of the bus, and when he protested, he was arrested.
Yes.
And I've talked to a great number of African-American veterans who came back and found they couldn't get anything to eat. They were just absolutely dismissed, that their whole process of fighting for their country is wiped out as they come back. And they are back, once again, part of a segregated society. It didn't matter what their service had been.
Absolutely.
Didn't count.
Didn't count at all. Of course, I had two older brothers. One was in the Pacific. Well, he flew into Iwo Jima. He was a Seabee to help build a landing strip there. But when he came back, he was just another colored person, as they said. My other brother was a truck driver with the Red Ball Express. And the invasion of Europe, that when he came back, same thing, nothing had changed. Now, neither one of them suffered injuries or anything and didn't die. But the injustice and the indecency about a situation like that was terrible.
Do you remember your first client?
Yes.
Would you tell me a little bit about what that case was?
It was a very simple thing. I was a guy who needed a deed to a piece of property, or two people changing a piece of property. And I knew how to do a deed. A real estate broker cut his office in half and gave me half of his office to put my office in after I left Horace Hill. I worked for Mr. Hill for about 3 months, passed the bar, and then went and got my own office. And these two people were exchanging a lot. And so they hired me to draw the deed. And the real estate broker came in and showed me where to put the names. It was my first piece of business. It was a deed, and my fee was $7.
Who would have been, while you were in private practice, your most memorable client or most memorable case?
Well, I guess my most memorable case would be 2 murders that I tried. Both with the black perpetrator and white victim. In both of those cases, they were charged with second-degree murder. Both of them occurred in a fight among blacks and whites. And I got both of them off with with manslaughter, which was a major, major victory at that time. They were almost sure to go to prison for life. But I got a jury that only convicted them of manslaughter. That was a great, great victory. In terms of criminal work, that got me a lot of publicity early in my career, and the whole community was up about it. And so it was very memorable there. But I guess the St. Augustine cases are the great public thing that I think back on. Although I only tried one case in St. Augustine, representing sit-inners was very memorable to me. I bump into some of these old men now who were kids back then, and they remind me, you were my lawyer back in the 60s.
And that's interesting that you deal with these murder cases, because later on the court you're going to be dealing with some murder cases as to the fairness of the death penalty, and we'll talk about those cases a little bit later. Talk to me about how you got into being a judge. When were you first appointed to the court, and by whom?
Well, my first position was that of United States Magistrate full-time in Jacksonville. And at that time, United States Magistrate judges were chosen by United States District Court judges. I got the vote of the judges of the Middle District of Florida back in 1971 to become the first United States magistrate in the district. We had another officer who did some of those duties, but Congress passed the United States Magistrates Act. I knew all of the judges of the Middle District of Florida well because I had served for 4 years as an assistant United States attorney. And I had been very active in the courtroom, trying many, many jury cases. So I knew all of the judges in the district. I had appeared before all of them. So they thought I was qualified for that position. They were ready to have, the Justice Department had hired me as the first black assistant U.S. attorney in the South. They were ready to have the first lowest level judge as a United States magistrate. So I got that position. I stayed in that position for 4 years. And then Governor Askew brought a new system for selection of justices to the Supreme Court of Florida and to the other appellate courts, called a merit selection system that he put in place in 1972. Under that system, you would apply for a vacancy, go before a commission, be questioned. That commission would send 3 names to the governor, and the governor would choose one of those people. I went through that process. My name was sent to the governor, and he selected me for one of 4 vacancies, vacancies that had occurred because of alleged misconduct on the part of 4 of the justices, and all of them did not get relieved. Many of them, 2 of them retired, But I came on at a time when the court was remaking itself, or the governor was remaking that court. And although I was appointed in 1975, under the laws that then existed, you had merit selection, but you did not have merit retention.
You had to run.
You had to run. So I had to run for office in every county in Florida statewide. And I'd never done that.
Let me hold. I want to talk about that election a little bit, but let me go back. And what did you do in specific, as an assistant U.S. attorney?
As an assistant U.S. attorney, I represented the government. I worked for the Department of Justice, and we did both civil and criminal cases. But I primarily tried criminal cases. As I mentioned earlier, I tried 2 big murder cases, and therefore I sort of went into the criminal side of the office rather than the civil side. And shortly thereafter, I was promoted to first assistant U.S. attorney, which meant I supervised the Jacksonville office. And of course, that was the first time the Justice Department had African-American lawyers representing the people of the United States. So I got appointed to the Supreme Court in 1975. Then I had to run for office in 1976. I did so with a lot of help.
Did you work for John Briggs?
Yes, I did.
What was your reaction to him? Obviously, he was very supportive of you.
A great, great man, a fine United States attorney. Never let politics interfere with his duty as the chief United States attorney. He's one of my favorite people. Actually, I was hired, however, by a man named Eddie Boardman. I went into the office in '66. The parties changed in '68, and John Briggs came along at that time, and they were both great United States attorneys.
Now, I've uncovered a couple of stories about you. I want to check and see if they're correct. There were, at one point, the draft board was near your office, and there'd been a lot of threats, bombs, and all kinds of activities against the draft board. And I have heard that you put up a large sign outside your office. The draft board is located at 400 Bay Street, not in this office.
Well, I had help in doing that.
Okay.
Yeah,
Well,
that happened.
at least you didn't want them bombing the wrong place, right?
That's right. And that brings together another thing. I held another position. It was called conscientious objector hearing officer that had to do with the draft. And in that process, it was my job to interview and to hold a hearing for people who claimed that they were conscientious objectors. And then I would write a report to the Department of Justice to have the Justice Department determine whether they were entitled to an exemption from the draft. And that was very interesting.
Of course, this is the height of the Vietnam War.
Height of the Vietnam War.
And the draft was still, by then, still in place.
Oh, absolutely.
Later it's going to be dropped by Nixon, but not
Right.
then.
But it was still in place, and that.
And on that basis, conscientious objector Muhammad Ali
Yes.
was one, and that was on religious grounds.
Yes.
What other grounds would be
It
acceptable?
was primarily religious. Yes, you would have to prove. It
So a Quaker.
didn't say religious. It said the exact words were a well-formed belief that war is wrong, or something like that. A moral conviction that it was wrong that would not allow you to serve in the military.
But it would be easier if you were a member of the Quaker Church or something.
It was all. That was the way the language was. But yes, it always came down to a religion.
Yeah, so you could just say, personally, I don't believe in war. Would that be acceptable?
That
No.
would not do it. You would have to show, the best way to show it was that your father had never served in the military because of some conviction that he had, that you were a member of a church that had long held that position, that you were very active in the church in that, and that you did other things.
You demonstrated
that demonstrated your love for humanity.
Yeah.
So just saying I'm a member of a certain church, that wouldn't do it. No, you had to do more. And they always brought their pastor They brought people from the church. They would bring school teachers who would testify that when they talked about war in Charles, this kid would get upset or whatever. But you could make out a case. It wasn't easy, but I didn't keep numbers of how many I granted. I would guess about half.
Were you aware that some people were really using kind of a scam to try to get out?
Oh, yes. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I was involved in the Vietnam era again. I prosecuted every single case of a draft dodger in the state of Florida. It just turned out that I was the only veteran in the Jacksonville office. And the induction center was in Jacksonville. And so a draftee would be told to step forward to indicate their willingness to enter the service. And of course, those who did not step forward were arrested right away. And so the place of the violation was always Jacksonville for the whole state of Florida. So I tried all of those cases.
It was logical for you as a veteran to do that.
It was logical for me as a veteran, and you had to understand the whole draft mechanism. You had to know the classification. You had to know everything anybody was sitting on a draft board would know. Everybody in the office didn't need to learn all of that. So I learned the entire draft procedures so that when there was testimony of what had occurred and what was in the file, I would know exactly what it meant and could, before the jury, question the draft board officer as to what the process that took place. But it was good to have a veteran doing that, of course.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Sure, you didn't want someone who had not been in the service doing it.
What was your personal view of the war at that time?
Gung-ho. I believed it. Because I'd just come out of the military. I believed that you're told to serve, you serve. And of course, as it went on and on and on and on, my belief in it then started withering. But early on, I was ready to take whatever my president said. And, that was the law, and I had obeyed it. And I had served. My brothers had served when they couldn't even vote. My other brothers had served. It was just sort of automatic that you protect the country. And then I finally realized that just about the time the President Johnson realized that this is not going anyplace.
Well, this is about the time King came out against the war.
Yes.
And
yes.
he thought there were too many African Americans that had been drafted in and that they were doing all the fighting. And it was, of course, he was a pacifist anyway.
For sure.
But he thought it was an unfair burden
Yes.
on African Americans. Would you agree with his point of view?
Yes, belatedly. But I'd grown up like most kids in America. You're in the Boy Scouts, and you go from the Boy Scouts to the Army. My brothers had done it. The president's got to be right, and that's that. But so it didn't bother me at all to prosecute draft dodgers. I had done my duty, and there were a lot of other people who do. Why is this guy not doing it?
And many of these must have been pretty clear-cut cases.
Oh, yes.
I mean, it wouldn't be too difficult to convict them because they had deliberately avoided the draft.
That's right. No,
Did you ever
no.
get any who had gone to Canada or Sweden and had come back?
No, no. If I remember correctly, we were not bringing them back in those days.
Probably not.
But I never had one. But I was aware that lots of people had gone to Canada. Yeah, just stayed there.
Now, one other bit of trivial information I have is that you organized the U.S. Basketball League, where the U.S. attorneys apparently played the FBI. Is that right?
Yes.
How'd you do?
We didn't beat those guys very much.
They were in pretty good shape, weren't they?
That's right. Well, we were in pretty good shape too, but not as good a shape as they were in. And they just were taller, that was all. But yes, we played basketball Wednesday nights or on Wednesday afternoons, and had a lot of fun. Of course, the teams changed all the time.
Sure.
Because the two guys are off on a special assignment, and one of us is up trying a case. But it was something to do, and it helped bind us together. We had to work together.
You had to work with them.
We had to
Very
work
closely, yeah.
very closely. So it took some of the tension out.
Discuss with me what kind of cases you had as a magistrate.
A magistrate judge at the time I served was the lowest ranking judge who had jurisdiction over misdemeanors on the criminal side, and who had such duties as the district judges assigned on the civil side. Much of my time was spent trying misdemeanor cases on the 3 Navy bases in Jacksonville, because any misdemeanor that occurred on that federal land was a federal offense. So I tried those misdemeanor cases, that's speeding, shoplifting, failing to stop for a stop sign, not anything very large, but all these things occurred on a federal reservation, so they had to be tried by a federal judicial official, and that was the United States Marshal. But then the judges would give me specific jobs to do, where I would write a report to the judge, and the judge would either adopt my report or not. And that was the good side of the work. It's not much fun going to the base trying captains' wives about speeding when their only excuse was I was going no faster than the other person. Those were the kind of things that I was trying. I learned a lot there, though. I learned to keep my mouth shut and to listen. People would be giving defenses that were not defenses, but they liked the point if you would listen to them and then ask them questions. And you still find them guilty. And, but listen, they want to be heard. I found that out early in being a judge. The case should have been 5 minutes, and you know we're now 20 minutes. And as I said, the Navy wife was 10 miles over the captain's wife was 10 miles over the speed limit, and her defense is she was driving the same speed as everyone else. You have to listen to that.
Well, there's a certain element of fairness.
That's right.
They have a right to tell their side.
Exactly, and that's what they want, and that's why I always say the lower courts are the places where the judges have to be very, very careful, where they're dealing with the public without attorneys present and the people not knowing the rules. Those people get their whole impression of what courts are like from those little experiences. You know, the very fine citizen doesn't end up in the circuit court charged with anything, or in federal court charged with anything. They go to county court. That's where they get the idea of what justice is all about. And if the judge will not listen to them and not explain to them sometimes what needs to be explained, they get a very bad impression of the court system. And so I like to tell the county judges and lower-ranking judges and magistrate judges, just take the time to talk to the person, but make sure they tell you everything they want to tell you before you rule, whether it's absolutely relevant or not. Of course, you can't go on forever like that, but listen and then rule against them. They go home feeling a lot better.
Once you got on the court as a judge, did you know this is what you wanted to do? Did you have an affinity for it?
Yes, yes. I have an affinity for law, period. I've enjoyed every minute as a poor practitioner, all practicing by myself, to a lower judicial office, to the Supreme Court, to the top federal court in the area. I've enjoyed all of it, and I'm even enjoying now hanging around with a large law firm. But yes, judging came easy for me. After all, I had seen every kind of wickedness and every kind of unfairness that you could possibly see. Having been born in the Deep South in 1932 to poor parents. So it was always good for me to try to make sure things came out the right way, that constitutional rights were protected, and that people's cases were heard and decided in a reasonable way and within a reasonable time.
While we're on this, and we'll talk about this later with some of your other experience, but what makes a good judge at any level? What qualities?
Well, I think I just mentioned one. Listen. That every good judge must do. I think a judge must be smart. Not brilliant, not brilliant, but smart enough to listen to myriads of facts and to be able to get to the issue that controls and decide it. And don't take all day to decide it. Once he or she has gotten to the issue and has heard everyone on it, go on and be decisive and say it's this way or it's that way. And don't always look to cut, as we say, cut the baby in half. Make a strong ruling if it's required. And that's just all to it. And of course, courage. That's the next thing. Have the courage to do what is the right thing to do without regard to criticism. Because every judge is going to get a lot of criticism that comes with the job. And if you're not willing to have, if a judge is not willing to be criticized and to make hard decisions, you should go home. Give up the job of being a judge and do something else. Go practice law where you don't have to be fair. All you have to do is argue your side of the case. If you want to do that and go home and sleep, well, I did what my client wanted me to do, that's the thing. But if you're willing to go home and worry about what is the right thing to do, not only under the law, but under just common sense too, and not too much common sense, but more law than common sense, but have the courage to just say, plaintiff wins, and here's why. Let the appellate court take care of it. If you're on the appellate court, say, let the Supreme Court take care of it. I've done the best. But you ought to walk away every time. Every judge should walk away every time feeling, I've done justice in this case. I've followed the law, and I've decided on the facts that were presented to me. And I think that now that we are seeing so much criticism as judges, it's because we've got to go back and teach civics. People believe that judges operate the same way legislators or executive branch people operate. And the Florida Bar has just found that out in the last couple of years, and we're going back to try and educate the public and say, listen, this is not, just look up in the air and make a decision. I think the Chavez case was the worst example, I think, most of us have ever seen, where the public believed, or were led to believe, this was just a matter of choice. Didn't know about the case that was 12 years ago. No one ever talked about it.
Well, there's a good example of courage from a judge.
Yes, absolutely.
Who made, I guess, made the same decision 6 times or something?
Yes.
I remember John Briggs talked about you. He mentioned your uncommon common sense. And this is something that you just mentioned that's difficult sometimes, because the law and common sense, sometimes it's hard to bridge those two, isn't it?
Exactly. That's why I said, well, you want common sense, but not too much of it. The judge can't just look up in the air and say, oh, this is the way it's always been, this is the way it should be. You've got to follow precedent. You've got to remember the facts that were presented. You know, there are a lot of cases where one side would have won that lost because they didn't assemble the evidence. The lawyers simply did not put the case together well, and they lose. And that lawyer may be on the popular side of the case, and another lawyer would have won it. But if you aren't able to assemble evidence and present it in a routine and organized way, you run the risk of losing. And it's not the judge's fault.
How difficult is it for you, particularly as you get on the Supreme Court and the Court of Appeals, to write opinions? I know from another source that you're a great fan of Strunk and White.
You've done your research.
And one of the things that, as a historian, sometimes I find difficulty with some of these decisions, it's so convoluted, the language, that it's difficult to sort of parse the actual decision. And I notice that you write pretty straightforward decisions.
Absolutely. I came to the Florida Supreme Court after, number one, trying cases. I had not done a lot of writing. I was in the courtroom trying bad guys, defending the government in civil cases, rather than sitting and worrying about writing for a critical audience. So when I was appointed to the court, I went to writing schools every chance I got. I wasn't a very bad writer because on Saturday mornings at Howard Law School, you have to go in for writing. So I'd had courses in writing the law, but I knew I was going to be writing for the most critical audience possible. That's every lawyer in the country. And so I went and tried to do that. And I remember the first thing that happened in writing school, there were 25 judges sitting around the table. The instructor gave us a case, a set of facts, and said, write the opinion. And so we wrote the opinion. And then he had us exchange them. And then for each of us to say what we thought the case was about, what that guy over there thought it was about when he wrote this case. And that gave me a lesson from that first day. This was at the University of Colorado. And they told us there, it says in the first paragraph, say what the case is about, and say what the ruling is. Don't act like you don't know the end of the story. And you're writing the opinion, you know what the end's going to be. Go on and tell them in the first paragraph. Then he gave us another example where there was an opinion written by a judge and a reporter reporting the case. He said, do you think they match up at all? And they didn't, because their judge had not written the opinion, so that the reporter could quickly get into it and find out what the court had really held. And from that, I went on saying, we're going to always set it up. In the first paragraph, we're going to say what happened. We're going to tell them how it's coming out, too. It's not a mystery. And we're going to break up the issues and talk our way through each one of them. And,
I notice you do that quite precisely. You
Yes.
take issue by issue as you, rather than try to give an overview.
Every issue. Obviously, you talked to one of my law clerks, a former law clerk. Yeah, stroke and white. The first day they come in, I throw it down. Most of them would see it if they were at a good law school. But if they haven't, here's your copy. And don't bring me any drafts that violate it, because I'll put smiley faces or frowny faces on it.
Well, you'd be happy to know historians do the same thing. We put exactly the same book out.
Yeah,
So you start with this,
exactly.
then you get your facts, and then you bring me the story.
Exactly.
Now, your appointment to the Supreme Court was by Reuben Askew, and
Yes.
I've done about 24 hours of interview with Reuben Askew and had him talk about your appointment to some degree. And as I recall, you may want to refresh my memory on this. He had called you to the governor's mansion,
Yes.
and you'd sort of sat around out by the pool or something and talked with him. And he said that conversation was what really persuaded him, because at that point there were three people on that nominating, the final three that were nominated to the governor. And that was something that he wanted to demonstrate to the people of the state of Florida. I think the way he put it, you can evaluate the state by the quality of the jurists.
Yes.
And he realized that, we won't get into any names, but on the Supreme Court, there'd been quite a bit of malfeasance and misfeasance, and he really wanted to change that, because some of the appointments, let's be fair, were political appointments. But as I understand from his point of view, which knowing Reuben Askew, he doesn't mince any words about these things. You know, he tells it pretty straight. So I thought that was a pretty significant comment on his point. What would your reaction be to that? That he thought it was one of the best decisions he made while he was governor?
Well, I read that, or I've heard that he has said that. No, I've read it. I agree with it.
Well, that's good.
But I was very surprised. I applied, but I'd been in the federal system a long, long time as an assistant U.S. attorney and as a full-time magistrate. I had not been dealing in the state courts, and so I thought that was against me. And I went to before the commission, I was asked about that. And I said, well, you know, you really don't have to know state law. You don't have to know federal law. You have to know how to research the law. And evidently that got me over on that. I think it did. But I was still apprehensive. And had I known, he treated me from the first minute he saw me as though he may appoint me. I went to the front door of the mansion just as you related, and the security man came, And he said, the governor says, go and have a seat out by the pool. Well, that was strange. I knew then, oh, hell, I'm really not going to get any real consideration. Except he showed up, and he was in tennis shorts, and he had 2 Cokes in his hand. He gave me a Coke, and we sitting there by the pool talking. I was thinking, this is awfully strange. I had on my best suit and everything. I'd prepared what I was going to say, and he just says, now tell me about your mother, things like that.
Well, his mother was very important to him.
Yes. And I told him about that, and what did you do in high school and all. And then when I got ready to leave, he got up and walked back around the mansion to where my car was parked. And we talked there a little while, and then I drove away. Of course, I was so happy I didn't know what to do. All my friends back in Jacksonville knew that I was being interviewed by the governor, and they were all there waiting for me when I got back to have a party, you see. So I didn't need to get appointed. I had already become a big shot just by getting the interview with the private interview with the governor. And of course, then he called, and I guess it was a Sunday night. And I really was surprised that, oh my God, I'm going to the Supreme Court of Florida. I haven't been in the state system in 4 years, and I've got to run for office. He did ask me, during the interview, now, if appointed, will you run? I said, yes. I was aware that I had to run in 15 months. I said, yes, I'll run. Well, of course, at that time, no African American had ever won a statewide race, and so, but I was going to lose. I thought, okay, you'll serve 15 months and then you'll lose, and you come back to Jacksonville. And because of that, I didn't move to Tallahassee. I left my family in Jacksonville until I won the election, because there was just no history of an African American winning a statewide race since Reconstruction.
I was going to say, yeah.
Yeah, since Reconstruction. And so I was, and of course I'd never run for anything.
Well, as you were waiting for the choice, did you expect that your race might ultimately count against you?
Yes.
Since no African American had ever been appointed to the Florida Supreme Court since Reconstruction.
Oh yes, I thought.
So you really were not expecting the job?
No. I had watched the campaign with Ruben Askew, but I didn't know very much about him. And in fact, there was not much at that time. Had I researched it, that would have told me that he would appoint me. I mean, he's from Pensacola, and there was nothing to say that this is a man that's going to change the state of Florida. Of course, he quickly did change the state of Florida in a lot of ways, some of which I was a part of.
He made some pretty strong appointments
Yes.
during that period of time.
Exactly.
Who would it have been? Sundberg would have been appointed?
Sundberg, Overton,
Ben Overton?
Ben Overton, Arthur England won by election.
Yeah.
But first was England, then Overton, then Sundberg, and then I came on.
Talk about your first day on the Florida Supreme Court. What was your reaction? How were you treated by your colleagues?
The first thing that got me was it was so quiet. I had been in a turmoil as an assistant U.S. attorney, oh my God, I've got a hearing here. I've got a hearing before this other judge at 3 o'clock. I've got to get a jury panel ready for tomorrow morning. And then as a magistrate, the FBI and everybody's bringing search warrants, and they're bringing in arrested people, and all day long I'm explaining constitutional rights, ruling on motions, and doing all of this, and going home at night exhausted. And then I came over to the Florida Supreme Court. That first day I went into the office. Of course, I met all of the justices at the swearing-in ceremony, and it was quiet. There was no one saying anything to me. I had a law clerk, and then the files started coming in. And those big red files that are the death penalty cases started coming in. And I wondered to myself, have I done the right thing? This is so lonely, and you're all alone here. And that kept every day. There's no one running in and out of a whole lot. You're there. But I finally got accustomed to the quietness of it, the stillness of it, which is good. But I'd been in such a flurry all the time about hitting deadlines and listening to people talk all day and argue about things all day, that it was different. The appellate court was just so different. Then I got so busy till I didn't have time to worry about that anymore.
And when you started,
My colleagues were good to me.
and Roberts was still on the court then.
Yes, he was.
Adkins was on the
Atkins
court.
was the Chief Justice.
Boyd.
Boyd, yes.
Who else? England was still on it.
England,
Sundberg.
Overton, and Sundberg. Yes.
How many clerks did you have, and what other assistants could you call on for research?
Well, at first I had one law clerk, and then after about 6 months I got two. That was what was allowed for everyone. And I got two. And that was about it. That's about all this. And I had a secretary. That was it.
Isn't there a sort of a legal resource office? Maybe that comes later.
Oh, way later.
Okay.
Way later.
You wish they'd had one.
That's right. That's right. No, I was very happy when I got two law clerks.
Now, I know you can't really talk about much of this, but can you give me some idea of what a typical day would be, and how often and when you would meet with your colleagues, either individually or unbanked?
Yes. First of all, on Mondays we always held a conference, and the conference would go from about 9 o'clock always until noon. That's when we would discuss opinions that were being circulated, determining which ones would be filed, and assigning time for dissents to be in, and that kind of thing. The real work of the court, the opinion-making work of the court. We tried to keep that session separate from administrative problems about who we should hire for something. What should we ask the legislature for? Those kind of administrative things we kept separate. And we would hold those administrative meetings on some day other than Monday mornings. Of course, on a week when we were having court, every day would be an argument for the mornings. But the days away from the oral argument is when I would go back to the office on a Monday when there was no oral arguments. I would have drafts from law clerks on opinions that I had been assigned. We also had petitions, and we circulated those. Someone wanted jurisdiction in the Supreme Court. They would petition for certiorari or some type of jurisdictional writ. And we would circulate that. That went fairly fast, and I could read through that. Oh, we do have jurisdiction. No, we don't. And sometimes so questionable, send it to a law clerk. So I'd get the jurisdictional things out of the way. And then I'd start in on the draft opinions. Of course, during that same week, if you've got a hearing week coming up, you've also got to read the briefs to be ready for that next week. So then I'd get on briefs, and of course you take them home with you, and many times I did, because it's just not enough time to do all of the reading, but within an 8-hour day, you can't keep up that way. The worst part of the job was that when I was at the Supreme Court, we believed, the court had decided that in a capital case, every justice should read the record. And in a capital case, number one, the record can be very large. And I mean, read the transcript, the testimony. We were supposed to, we thought that we had to review the entire file, whatever there was. Well, that can take hours and hours and hours, and is the most depressing thing you could ever want to do. Because we even believed that you should look at the exhibits. So there's the bloody towels, and there were all of that stuff. The court doesn't do that anymore, I don't think. They don't think it's necessary to read every word that is in the record, but we did at that time. And that was the part of the job that was the worst.
That's a pretty tough decision too, isn't it?
Always.
Life and death. How did you feel in general about the death penalty?
I went on the court not believing in it at all. Much to, well, I had real bad luck on that. When I was appointed to the Supreme Court, it was during the period where the death penalty was unconstitutional in Florida. Just before my election in 1976, the Supreme Court ruled the Florida system constitutional. Then I had to decide something. What do I do now? I decided that it didn't matter, that I didn't like the death penalty, didn't want to impose it, that I was either going to have to resign from the court or follow the United States Supreme Court. And so when I went out campaigning, I was asked that question about the death penalty. People had heard earlier that I was against it and was glad that it was gone. And I answered just that way. I said, well, I promised to follow the teachings of the United States Supreme Court, and that's what I'm going to do. I don't have to like it. If I'm going to be a judge, I'm going to have to follow the dictates of the Supreme Court. And that may be good that I don't like it, because I'm surely going to give it a stronger test than those who do like it. And
so it would have to be a pretty strong case, though, for you to vote for the death penalty?
Oh, no. No, if it fell within the law, I voted for it.
Okay.
That's all. That's the only way you can sleep. That was the only way I could go home and go to sleep. The United States Supreme Court says this is the law. Joey, you have to follow that. And if you're not going to follow it, although you just got elected, you ought to quit. You ought to go home.
Did you have anything to do with the Lee and Pitts case? You remember that?
Oh, yes. Not with the original case, but it came back to the court many, many years later. Now, I can't recall now why it came back. I guess the legislature.
I think they got some new information, or
That's right.
Askew had reopened the case or something. He had.
Yeah, the case got reopened, and it came back by, but I guess the legislature gave one of them a pardon.
Yeah, they did, eventually,
Yeah.
eventually.
Okay.
I remember.
I don't remember why it came back, but it came back on a habeas corpus type of action for some reason. And I don't know that we did not reverse the conviction, obviously, the sentences, we did not. But I think, as we've said, the legislature did finally pardon two of them.
I think they both were eventually pardoned, yeah.
Yes.
They were never compensated.
Right.
Yeah, it was proved, I think, that somebody else had committed a robbery, and that's what I can't remember the details either, but I remember talking to Askew about that, and that was a very important case for him because he thought they'd been unjustly convicted.
No, but they were already under the sentence when I got to the Supreme Court.
Okay.
And I don't remember ever playing any significant role in that.
How would you decide what cases to give a writ of certiorari?
Just follow the law. There's precedent, and just follow the precedent. Of course, if it's a matter of first impression, you can't do it. You have to come up with a rule, and you do so and hope that the Supreme Court of the United States agrees with you.
How many cases, new cases, would you take every year?
In the Supreme Court?
Yeah.
I don't remember the number. 200 maybe. A large caseload.
That's a lot of cases.
That's a lot of cases.
In the depth that you have to go, because you've already got previous testimony and other decisions to look at.
Well, and I need to mention that the jurisdiction has now been changed from the jurisdiction that the court had when I was there. You could get anything to the Florida Supreme Court until 1982, I think, that we changed the jurisdiction. And now, of course, us lawyers say you can't get anything to the High Court. I'm on the other side, I'm on broad jurisdiction. But we narrowed the jurisdiction, so the court doesn't get as many cases now. But a divorce in West Palm Beach, you could get a review.
Just send it right up,
Supreme Court. It just came all the way through the system. And we had not fashioned our district courts of appeals well. Once we fashioned the district courts of appeal, that cut off the ready access to the Florida Supreme Court. But that was not in place when I was there. You'd get every kind of traffic court cases almost. The Supreme Court got to everything. And let me mention that is alleged to be one of that kind of jurisdiction was wanted by certain members of the court. Those who no longer served on the court, who left the court. They wanted to be able to reach down and get anything from any place over the state, I am told.
How much much influence on the Florida Supreme Court with just 7 members does the chief have? I know it's passed on on a rotating basis, but once somebody is Chief Justice, does that give them any influence as they sometimes have in the United States Supreme Court?
Yes, but not very much.
Not much.
In terms of how a case comes out, it's very little influence. The little influence that you could have there is that the Chief Justice is the senior member of the court while chief. Seniority never goes out, except the chief jumps up in seniority because no one can serve more than 2 years. So if you're the Chief Justice and you have a case that's split, say 4-3, and you're on the 4 side, whoever's on the 4 side gets to assign that opinion, that can be significant because, let me give you the worst case. The split is 3-3, and then the chief must vote. The chief can make a big difference in how that case comes out according to the justice that he or she selects to write the opinion. After all, the chief has been in the conferences, he's heard everyone on it. He knows that they're a block, but even within that block, there are splits, you see. And the chief would know where the splits are, even on each side, and say, now if I give it to this fellow on this side, he will write a different, a weaker opinion for his side than that other guy. Or the chief can join a side and assign the opinion to himself or herself, and then either strengthen the position that he likes or weaken it. So in appointing authors of opinions, that's one place that's about the only place where the chief can influence the strength or weakness of an opinion.
And the chief always assigns who writes the opinions?
No, only when the chief is on the prevailing side.
Okay.
But he's able to make a prevailing side because he votes last, and he's in charge. So if it's 3-3 and it's time for him to vote, he can have a strong opinion one way, a weak opinion another way, a strong opinion the other way, whatever. But that's about all.
Let me talk about your run for election in 1976. And as you mentioned earlier, you did not run for anything. You were not about to start raising money. And obviously, a lot of people in the state of Florida came to your assistance. Absolutely. And the one I would think would be most important this time would have been Chesterfield Smith.
No question about it.
Who had tremendous influence throughout the state.
Absolutely. Well, throughout the
country, yeah.
Chesterfield Smith, of course, had been the president of the Florida Bar. He was coming off of his presidency with the American Bar Association. He had been very, very active in the American Bar Association's efforts to have a full investigation of President Nixon. Mm-hmm. In fact, it was Chesterfield Smith who said something to the effect that if the president has involved himself in this kind of activity, that the kind of activity charged, he should be impeached. He went that far, and early on.
I talked with Chesterfield about this. He said he'd heard about it sitting at a Redskins football game, and he decided that he needed, as president of the ABA, to make a personal statement about this. Yeah. And at that time was a little dangerous because this was very early on, long before he is going to have to step down.
That's right. But, of course, I had known Chesterfield Smith since my days as an assistant U.S. attorney. He had been the law partner to Judge McRae in Jacksonville. And so he'd come up and visit Judge McRae. And Judge McRae called me up and introduced me to Chesterfield Smith early on. And in fact, he sort of became my mentor in everything from then on. I talked to him first about most things.
So did most governors.
Yes. And so when I got appointed and I had to run, he came to me. He says, I'm going to help you win this thing. Well, that was really the beginning. And he then became the titular head of my campaign. He put it out. He was running the campaign. And the law firms just started falling in place. It was the right place to be on Chesterfield's side. If Chesterfield's for this guy, he's all right. And especially the large law firms, those who competed with Holland and Knight. And so I got help from every large law firm in the country. The newspapers played a good role. I got endorsed by every newspaper except some little newspaper out on Miami Beach that I've never been able to find. And so Chesterfield Smith put the whole thing together. Then he was able to go out and attract others to go onto my committee. These were people who would really do the work. And former staff members of Reuben Askew joined my campaign. Hal Ferguson, a lawyer who had been working for the governor, became my active campaign manager. And they put together a fine campaign. And so I won by a large percentage.
Now, your opponent was Harvey Duval, who was a circuit court judge, and a lot of people have argued that this campaign was not only racist, but he frequently misrepresented your positions.
No question about it.
How did that play out? Did he get traction with those kinds of arguments, or do you think the public turned against him because he had exaggerated your record?
Oh, the public turned against him. And it was not only racist and ugly. During the course of the campaign, the Miami Herald came up with articles showing that he had benefited by his position as a judge in many ways. Trips without pay, and people were paying him to do this and to do that. And all of that came out. I think that one of the most damaging things was that the day I was sworn in, he had a press release, released a statement saying he was going to run against me. He had never met me. I had never written an opinion. I was just being sworn in that day, which was one of the dumb things. I'm glad he did it. It was a very dumb thing to do. And we never did let him forget that. My campaign people used that in everywhere he would show up. We would ask him, why in the world did he decide to run against me on the day I was being sworn in? What had I written? Well, I hadn't written anything. So what did I do wrong on my first day? He never got a good answer to that. On the other thing is, we had a meeting late one night that Chesterfield attended, because when we were together debating, he would stand over me and put his finger down at me and say all kinds of things that were not true or anything. And I would not answer it. We decided not to answer it. I would get up and just talk about the court and what we were doing and never mention his name. That wasn't selling well, especially in the black community. I would go down to Fort Lauderdale, and they would be, my campaign people there, African American, would be so angry with me and say, what are you doing? I said, well, we've decided that we're not going to get in this fight this way, that I'm the incumbent, and I'm the public servant here on the highest court, that I should not conduct myself. And he says, oh, you've got to answer me. You can't just sit there like that. So we had a late night meeting, and Chesterfield was there, and he said, you're going to hold the course. I said, that's going to be hard to do. He said, well, do it. And my opponent never did realize what we were doing to him. The contrast was so different. He was just ranting and raving and coming very close to name calling. He never did that, but it was obvious that he was throwing race into it. And I should go on and ignore it. Don't say a word about it. Talk about what we were going to do in Florida, how we were going to change merit retention, and how the state was going to be improved by the new court. And so, yes, it was very bad.
I remember that article in Miami Herald was written by a young reporter named Tom Fiedler.
Yes.
And one of the things he uncovered, the judge had said he had only been reversed 15 or 20 times. Turned out he'd been reversed 50 or 60 times.
That's right, yes.
And Fiedler wrote that it was the most bitterly contested Supreme Court race in the history of the state.
Oh, no question about it, no question about it.
But in the end, that strategy paid off because you won 61% of the vote.
That's right. Yes, yes.
And again, the first African-American elected to a
Yes.
statewide
Yeah,
position.
we took the right course, but Chesterfield was right there insisting that we take that course. And so we did.
What did that victory mean to you?
To me, well, I was surprised. I was overjoyed, of course, that I could get elected. Getting appointed is one thing, but going out and talking to the people and getting elected is something very special.
But by a large margin.
By a large margin, that's right. And so I was completely overjoyed. My family was overjoyed. And, it was just the height of everything to get elected to an office.
Did you see that as a turning point in civil rights?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Absolutely. For a margin like that back in 1976, that's unbelievable, too. It's like I said, I never believed I'd see a black judge. Well, I never thought I'd see one elected, for sure. And surely it wouldn't be me. Yeah.
One of the things I'd like to do, if it's okay with you, is I'd like to sort of go through your career and sort of determine when you went to the Circuit Court of Appeals, then come back and talk about some of your cases, if that's okay.
That's right. I really want.
When you, in 1979, were initially approached about being on the Circuit Court of Appeals, you were appointed by Carter.
Yes.
Who contacted you and what process did you go through? Were you being vetted? Did you talk with Carter? Did you talk to his representatives?
All of the above. I did everything. Let me go back for a while, though, and say that one good thing about my election was that I was running in 1976 when Carter was running. And I was spending most of my time in South Florida, and especially in the condominiums. Florida was, and still is, an early primary state. So the Carter people were at the rallies that I would attend. In other words, in a big condo, they have all the kind of candidates come. Well, I would go, and there'd be county judges there, and circuit judge races, and there would also be the Carter people there. So I got to know some of them, never thinking that, of course, that I was going to end up asking their dad, never dreaming that he was going to win in the first place. I didn't think he had a chance, but I got to meet some of them. And so when it came time to throw my hat in for that, I did have a few contacts. The other good thing was that Griffin Bell, who was the Attorney General, had been on the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, the court that I finally went to. But I had practiced before that court. I had argued before them. I knew Judge Bell, who was at that time. And I had been invited to the judicial conferences every year that I was in the system. That is, every year that I was an assistant U.S. attorney, I was invited to the conference. Every year that I was a magistrate, I had been invited to the conference. So I knew the federal judges. And I might add that one reason I was invited was, of course, to give the thing some diversity. There weren't many. It was either me or no one, because they didn't have any black judges around, and I was the nearest thing to it. So I always got invited. So I knew Judge Bell, I knew Judge Tuttle, I knew that they were friends, and that they had a good impression of me. So those are the kind of contacts I had. And I had successfully gone before one commission and got my name to the governor. Jimmy Carter, President Carter, put in the same process. I thought, well, I'll probably get through another one of these commissions, so I applied, and my name went forward. Now people tell me as I look back at, well, it was an easy pick for the president, and maybe it was. For one thing, I had already been through 3 full-field FBI investigations by that time, and I had just won by the margin you indicated in Florida. And so if you were going to choose an African-American for the Fifth Circuit, and everyone said that he wanted to do that, that's another reason I put in, I was a pretty good choice. Having my background all clean and having just been elected by the people of one of the states he was going to appoint me in. Plus, I, of course, had the help of Griffin Bell And hundreds of other people who wrote letters and made phone calls, and Senator Childs was a senior senator at that time. Chesterfield Smith knew him very, very well. Lots of folks wrote letters and made phone calls. And so it ended up being fairly easy. I didn't know it then.
Of course, you had to have the support of both of your state senators.
I did, yes. But it was Childs who really drove the thing. Senator Childs drove it.
Discuss why you decided to leave the Florida Supreme Court and go on the Court of Appeals.
Well, most of my practice before coming on the Florida Supreme Court had been in the federal court. I had just been through a terrible, terrible election. I didn't want to go through an election again. And I didn't know that the people of Florida were going to change the law a few months after my election. And I had great friends in the federal court system. And I didn't want to go out and raise money. I just didn't want to go through another statewide election. And there were people who were asking me to do it for historical reasons. The White House wanted to do it. I knew I could handle the position. And so with all of those things going, and I knew that the Attorney General thought that I would be a good candidate. And so I decided to do that, making a lot of enemies who would help me in my election, of course.
What would be the major difference between your work on the Florida Supreme Court and at this time you were with the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals?
Yes. Well, the difference is the impact of the cases that you rule on. Even when, before we narrowed the jurisdiction at the Florida Supreme Court, most of the cases that we decided there had statewide impact and were Florida constitutional type questions. Although the federal courts get very serious constitutional questions, most of what they get, the federal courts get, had something to do with criminal law. It's a federal conviction that you're reviewing, or it's a state conviction on habeas corpus that you're reviewing. So about a third of the caseload is somehow related to a state court conviction. Then you get run-of-the-mill cases, Social Security cases, labor board cases, small tax cases that do not have statewide impact or impact all over the country or sets a new rule in constitutional law. Now, every now and then one of those comes along. It gets great publicity when it does come along, because usually if it's a United States constitutional question, of course you've got to stand up and look at it because it's going to affect everybody in the country. But at the Florida Supreme Court, it's almost statewide effect every time, and you're making brand new law. It's the difference between the United States Supreme Court and a state Supreme Court is the best way to do it. So I enjoyed both positions, but the effect that a ruling or vote had on the state citizens is greater than what happens in a federal court. My old court, the 11th Circuit, is churning out opinions today. You won't read about them. You won't read about them because it's routine federal litigation that can be anywhere from Federal Communications Commission rule change to an ICC regulation, things that have to be decided, but only affect the parties in that one case. Seldom does the Supreme Court of Florida affect only the parties in the case.
Now, when you were appointed to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, you had to have a hearing in Washington.
Yes.
Were you prepped for that, and how did that hearing go?
I was prepped for the hearing. Hearing went very well. You could almost call it no hearing at all. What we now see as confirmation hearings was nothing like when I came along in 1979. there were 12 of us at the same time back in when I had my confirmation hearing. We were prepped in that the Justice Department would tell you who had filed against you. That's not discussed very much, but to get on the agenda, you have to request a position. If you're going to show up at the hearing and blast one of the candidates, you have to sign up for that. And otherwise, they don't know how long to set the hearing, for example, or how many speakers they're going to have. And that's done days before the hearing. So the Justice Department finds out from the Senate who has signed up, and are they going to be in favor of or opposition to. And so you know that when you walked in. I walked in the room knowing that I was going to have no opposition. I knew that one of the judges with me was going to have opposition because he was the only one out of the 12. And that it was from the NAACP, and it was not going to be very serious. So the hearing lasted maybe an hour for all 12 of us. So at one point, there were 2 senators in the room. Senator Childs came, he introduced me to the court, and he went off to another hearing. And so it was almost an automatic process. If your 2 senators said you're okay, you're okay. The president had already nominated you. That was about it. As I said, the NAACP representative got up and said, one of these people has been a member of a private club that discriminates. And we want to put on the record that we are against that. And you know, right after I got on the course, there was a big thing about private clubs that discriminate. In fact, Griffin Bell was the one, and that was all hanging back there. So they wanted to come in and put on the record that they being the NAACP, it being the NAACP. And then they said, however, we withdraw our objection to his confirmation. They're just making a record. So it was just an automatic thing. It was a ceremony. And you go there and you get your picture taken with the senators, and that was about it. Now, of course, everything
It's a far cry from what you get later on with Bork or Clarence Thomas, or
yes,
even more recently Pryor.
Yeah, exactly.
And these are pretty partisan conflicts, aren't they?
Yes, oh, absolutely. Well, it was Bork, the first big one, and that started this whole political process in the confirmation process. But I think every federal judge before Bork, it was more ceremony than anything else.
How did the Fifth Circuit become the 11th Circuit?
By congressional separation requested by the court. The Fifth Circuit consisted of Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Texas. And by the time we split, we were authorized 26 judges. And we had 25. We never got up to 26. Somebody died, somebody leave, somebody retired. So we got up to 25. And it was unmanageable, just absolutely unmanageable. We would go in bonk, and a lawyer would have to stand and argue before 26 or 25 judges. And it got so bad that we would say, okay, let's have a rule. No one can ask any question of the lawyer until 10 minutes has passed, because the poor lawyers would never get their complete case out before the entire body. So that didn't work either. And so we finally said that we need to divide this court. Now the interesting thing is, and this will get into how courts have changed, about that time, the caseload in the Fifth Circuit was about 7,000 cases. We had 25 judges at the highest point. And we thought that was too many cases. We can't handle this. It's unmanageable. We went to the Congress, said split us, and they did. The interesting thing now is the 11th Circuit still has 12 judges. The same number. The Fifth Circuit, that we kept the number, they're up to about 21 judges. The caseload in the Fifth Circuit is above 8,000. The caseload in the 11th Circuit is about 8,000. And we don't consider that too many cases anymore. That's because we've changed the way cases are heard in appellate courts. But just back in 1981, we asked the Congress, please, we cannot handle 7,000 cases with 25 judges. Now both sides are handling that amount with the 11th Circuit, not even changing the number of judges. What have we done, though? In Atlanta, we brought in 50 the law clerks who sit there at the court all day doing things. The 5th Circuit has 40 or so. Every judge on the 11th Circuit now has at least 3 law clerks, and the same over on the 5th Circuit. We've cut down oral arguments in the 11th Circuit to about 30% of the cases. And this is with all of the computers and with all of the modern means of communication. That's how much appellate practice has changed since I went on the court in 1979.
Of course, now it's an electronic record of all the cases. It's easier to access.
Easier to access, yes. Computers have just made such a difference. Wireless, all kinds of technology that we're bringing into the courts. Now, unfortunately, the federal courts are slow to use technology, nothing like the states. I can sit at for my firm, I do all of the appeals. I'm in charge of the appellate section of the firm. And I can sit here and see an argument over at the Florida Supreme Court. I don't have to leave my desk. One of my lawyers go up to Atlanta. If I want to see it, I have to go there. And I think that's going to change on the new Chief Justice. But Chief Justice Rehnquist was absolutely against any camera in the courtroom or anything. And you may recall that even on Bush v. Gore, they set up some kind of taping and something.
Did record it, but
yes,
that's it.
And that was it. And what could be more important for the people of the United States to see than that? But the federal courts are still holding on to that old idea that it's not dignified to have cameras in a courtroom and the electronic filings. They're very slow. We are very fast in Florida. We are way ahead and moving faster.
And it's interesting in the Florida Supreme Court, and I was talking to Major Harding and some other people about this, they said it was an extraordinary experience for the American people to see these very important pleadings.
Yes.
And the discussion of the law, which most people had never seen,
Exactly.
nor would they.
That's right.
And the Supreme Court got something like, 6 million hits every hour
Yes.
because they would automatically print out the
Right.
decisions, and they would be, everybody in the country could see them
Absolutely.
immediately.
Oh, yes.
That's
Yes.
a dramatic change.
That's
isn't
got
it?
to change. I think the new Chief Justice will put together a committee or something. I was on the Florida Supreme Court when we put cameras in the courtroom, and all of those fears were argued to us. And we said, all right, we're going to do an experiment. We did for 1 year. None of those horrible things ever happened that people said would happen. And now it's just, nobody even thinks of it anymore. It's just a proper thing to do. And that's a good contrast between the most important case in Americans' lives back in 2000. You could see it in the Florida Supreme Court, hear it, keep up with it. And yet in the United States Supreme Court, you could get a recording. That's about all it takes.
And they were reluctant to do that.
Yeah. Oh, yes, they were. Yes.
Well, now on the other side, Rehnquist as Chief Justice consistently appealed to Congress for more judges. I mean, he was acutely aware, I think, of the backlog of cases.
Yes.
But apparently, as one judge, I think it was Hodges, told me that they like judges, but they don't much like the court system because they don't give them enough money or enough judges.
Yes.
Is that true?
That's true. And of course, I was Chief Judge of the 11th Circuit. So as Chief Judge of the 11th Circuit, I attended the Judicial Conference of the United States along with Judge Terry Hodges, who in effect ran the thing. The Chief Justice would come in and say greetings and all, and then he would turn it over to Judge Hodges.
Of course, they were pretty good friends, I think.
Oh, I think so, yes. And of course, Judge Hodges is a very talented person. And Judge Hodges would run it. So if he says that's true, I'd bet on it that's what it was. And of course, we have to talk about judges' compensation too. As you know, it's tied to congressional compensation. And so judges only get a raise, federal judges only get a raise when Congress gets one. And Congress is afraid to give themselves a raise most of the time, and many of them don't need it, quite frankly. In the Senate, I think 92% or something are millionaires, so they don't care. And others have businesses and people back home taking care of them. And that's going to be a problem sooner or later. Not that judges should make the same amount of money as lawyers, they should not. But what has happened is that the gap has grown so different. Everyone expected, has no idea, that the pay scale would keep the same percentage away from lawyers as the lawyers go up. Now the lawyers are way up here, judges way down here. Somehow we're still attracting pretty good people to the federal courts. But how long that's going to go on, I don't know.
I know that some people have stepped down for financial reasons.
Oh, absolutely, yes.
They need to make enough to send their kids to school or whatever.
Yes, and that's beginning to be a trend, that people are stepping down. I don't mean going all the way to retirement and then leaving and going into a law firm. I mean, it's quitting the job after 5 years or 6 years. That's a very big loss.
Well, because it takes you that long sort of to figure out how it works, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah, you don't get to be a good judge when the law is changing, new statutes are coming out in a day, just like you don't get to be good at anything else for a while.
Well, Judge Hodges said something about the fact that had he retired before 30 years, he would have gotten no pension or something like that. I don't know what the issue was, but if he had retired at a certain point, he had to make a decision
Yes.
to whether this is a lifetime
right.
commitment or I'm getting out and making money.
Yes, you get trapped into the system because the magic number is 80. Your years of service and your age must equal 80. That is, you may retire when you're 70 with 10 years, and you may retire at 65.
With 15.
Yes, that's right. And there's a scale. And if you go to 10 years of service and you're not 70, you're not in town. So you get trapped in, so you've got to go to where it equals 80. For example, I stayed more years than I had to because I went on early. So instead of staying 20 years, I had to stay 22 years. And because then it would add up my age and I'd get 80. So that's what he's talking about.
Yeah.
Yes, when you get around the 10th year, you're in. Otherwise, you're not going to get into retirement.
Yeah, that seems so unfair, doesn't it?
Nobody cares about it. Nobody. Congress doesn't care.
Talk about a typical day on the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals.
Well, it's about the same as on the 11th Circuit. And it's pretty much the same as the state court. I would come in every morning. The first things I had to do was read my court's opinions that have been filed the next day, the previous day. You see, unlike the state courts, the judges are not in the same place. They don't see each other sometimes for months. You have no idea what one of your panels are hearing. That is, in some days in the Fifth Circuit, there'd be 4 panels out hearing cases. And you have nothing to do with that case until an opinion hits your desk. And then you have to read it and say, my God, did we rule this? My God, let's go and bark right away. So the first thing you have to do every morning is read your own court's opinion. And then the next thing is the petitions for rehearing. Every lawyer files, everyone that loses files a petition for rehearing. They're usually easy. You read through all of that. And then you go to what we call non-argument cases. The law clerks have done most of the work on those cases. And you go through those. You can get through that. Then you go to the opinions that you have to write, because that's the big stuff. And that's about it for that day.
How many opinions would you write in a year?
Well, I don't know. Here's the best thing. As in preparing for this argument, one of my partners had someone go through and pick out all of my opinions. That wasn't very hard. They went to a computer, of course. And I was surprised when I got the list. That was 700 opinions, 720 or something. But those were named opinions where I put my name on. Most opinions, you don't put your name on, you put per curiam. So if I had 700, it would be 2 or 3 times that amount. But I had 723, I guess, signed opinions. That was Supreme Court in my 22 years. Well, it would be 28 years with the Supreme Court. That's how many I had signed on to. So there were 2,000, 3,000 more.
And so some of those would be dissents, some of them would be agree in part.
Right.
How often did you dissent?
Often. Often.
Is that unusual?
I dissented more than some of the other judges, yes. Especially at the end of my term. The Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals was a great, I would guess you'd say, liberal court. A court that was on the cutting edge, especially, for example, in school desegregation. You know, after the Supreme Court said Brown versus the board is the law, it fell on the Fifth Circuit to make that work, to implement it, because those were the states, Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas. So the Supreme Court didn't say anything else other than deliberate speed. So every question then came to the Fifth Circuit, and the Fifth Circuit had to rule on busing, zoning, all kinds of issues that made that opinion that work. But it was called a great post-civil rights court. The 11th Circuit is now thought of by people who deal with it regularly as being a conservative court. So the last years I was on that court, I dissented more than a judge usually would.
In fact, I've read that it was, people think it's the most conservative.
Yes, some people even say it's the most conservative. But no question, it is nothing like the old Fifth Circuit once was. Now, for example, in the last 2 or 3 years, the 11th Circuit has ruled that affirmative action in education was unconstitutional. They ruled on a case putting prayer in the schools, in public schools. The Supreme Court had to knock that down. So on every burning issue in the last 3 or 4 years, the 11th Circuit has gone the wrong way, according to the United States Supreme Court.
What's your view on affirmative action while we're on that subject?
The same as the Supreme Court of the United States. It is constitutional. Don't know how long it should be constitutional, but there is a benefit, and that benefit is needed now.
So long as there's not a quota?
So long as it's not a quota, that's right. I agree with the Supreme Court.
And the University of Michigan case?
Yes, yes. Both of them.
There was a case, and you know these, and I don't recall them. I believe it was Croson versus Richmond that had a set-aside for minority firms.
Right.
And it turned out many of these minority firms were not minority firms at all. They were just some spokesperson who was fronting the thing. How would that affect a decision under those circumstances, assuming you think there should be set-aside?
No, I agree with the Supreme Court on education. Now, on set-asides for public works and contracts, that's a much harder question. And the Supreme Court of the United States hasn't spoken on that in a few years now. It's harder to apply, but it should be applied. You have to examine, is this a minority contract in the first place? Is there any history of the city or county discriminating against those type of contractors? And will it serve a public good to have a minority contract? And most of the time it comes out, yes. And I think most of the states now have not a set-aside, but some way of advancing the aims of contractors who are minority-owned.
Yeah, that terminology, you know, quotas and set-asides have sort of been removed from the legal decisions, I think, so that
No,
people.
those are bad.
Yeah,
That's bad. You can't have a set-aside, you can't have a quota.
yeah.
And that's fine. Yeah, I think the court came out absolutely right in the Michigan cases.
What is, if you would characterize your judicial philosophy, how would you explain it?
On what?
Just your overview, would you see yourself as more conservative, more liberal? Would you see yourself, let's say, as Clarence Thomas and Rehnquist and others,
Well,
an originalist?
on civil rights, I'm obviously liberal. On criminal law, I'm conservative. Put the bad guys in jail, keep them there, but give them a fair trial. On other social issues, I generally agree with the United States Supreme Court, even as conservative as it is now. For example, abortion. I think the court has done about as fine a job at that as it can do. It's a very, very, well, I don't have to tell you, it's a very tough question.
And it might change.
It might change, that's right. There are arguments both ways. I think they've done a good job so far with something that is that difficult.
Now, Scalia would argue that there's no such thing as a right to privacy. It's not in the Constitution.
Right. Well, most of what they talk about is not in the Constitution. For example, who would ever thought that the framers believed that a corporation could be a person?
That's right.
But so there's a lot of things that we have created, and the right to privacy is not in the Constitution, of course not. There's nothing in the Constitution that says a corporation is a person. There are a lot of things that are not in the Constitution. And if we had to do that, we'd get no place. If we had to find every right in the Constitution, they couldn't possibly, framers couldn't possibly have thought about the advances in technology, for example.
The internet,
Yes.
airplanes, anything.
Yes.
Yeah.
An internet crime, who would have ever thought of that? How do you have an internet crime? You don't have an internet.
Do you look at sort of an expanded, more elastic view of the Constitution, particularly, let's say, the 14th Amendment, equal
Absolutely.
protection under the laws?
Oh, absolutely. I believe it is an elastic Constitution, and we make it as we go. They're very broad principles, and we make them fit the situation that is before us. And that's what the court should do.
Well, now, the argument that Scalia would make when the court starts doing that, they are an activist court and they are taking up the responsibility of the legislature. They're making legislation as opposed to interpreting law.
Oh, I'm aware that he would, but there's no way that you can find a legislative enactment for every problem that comes to a court. Problems of first impression come to the court. For example, may a city, may a county or state punish a person with a prison sentence for an internet crime? There's no answer to that in any constitution anyplace. There's no one to come on that. The legislature says, yes, and here's the punishment. Isn't that good enough? Why do you have to go to the Constitution? Why do the courts have to stay out of it? And let the courts have to be creative. Now, I know that comes close to what people call an activist judge, but judges cannot avoid deciding issues of first impression, and they look for wherever they can find guidance. It's in the Constitution. No, it's not there. It's in a piece of legislation. It's not there. They can't tell the people, go home, we don't know the answer.
How important is precedent?
Very important. Very important. And I think most judges follow it. They almost have to. They get reversed if they don't. On statutory things, if the judge is wrong, the legislature can change it. And if it's a constitutional matter, your Supreme Court will resolve it. And again, judges can't say, go home, I don't know the answer. The parties are there, they rule on it. They use whatever they can find, history, whatever, to answer a question of first impression. And most of the time, if it's not strictly constitutional, people can change it through their legislature, or the executive branch can issue a proclamation. There's some other way if the court errs. And if the United States court errs, that's just too bad.
like the status of the prisoners in Guantanamo, the
Yes.
legislature now could come up with a
Right.
more formal, different constitutional response to the Supreme Court
Exactly.
decision.
Exactly. And they're doing it. Sure.
And if you look at some of these, some of this kind of a bad example, but Plessy v. Ferguson, 96, that precedent, by the time you get to 1954, is clearly wrong because on the face of it, they're not equal.
Right.
And the other argument that people have made on the other side, if you waited for the Mississippi legislature to integrate schools, might still be waiting.
Absolutely.
So in some issues, would you agree that the Supreme Court has an overriding responsibility to act?
Yes. And I'll go so far as to say the Supreme Court of the United States is more than a court. As one of my professors told me many years ago, it's the conscience of the nation. What changed between Plessy and Brown? The whole world changed. That's what changed. What was acceptable changed. What should be done changed. And so it's the conscience of the nation. It has to have a conscience somewhere. And in the political branches, you won't find them. And they shouldn't. Politicians are going to do what politicians do. The executive is going to listen to the cry of the crowd and is going to do whatever the crowd says in most instances. You have to have a body that can look at precedent, but also look at conditions and what the world is crying for, what the nation in its best sense is hoping for and crying for. And that's what happened before Brown. Sure. And if you read the Brown opinion, it's pretty clear that they are going on and doing what a historian and a philosopher and learned people wrote treatises, and they considered all of those treatises and said that education is just too important.
I remember Warren,
We've got to do something.
Chief Justice Warren talking over again about doing the right thing.
Yes.
And as you put yourself in other people's shoes and you
Yes.
protect their rights because they have no other way to protect it.
Sure. And remember, there is no precedent for the United States Supreme Court to follow. The only thing they've got is their own work, and so if they get a matter of first impression, they too can't say go home. We don't know. They have to decide.
What do you do when you have a real conflict about the law and your conscience?
As a judge,
Yes.
you follow the law. And if you don't want to do that, you should leave the bench.
Although sometimes it can be difficult to do that, I would
Very
imagine.
difficult. Very difficult, yes, yes.
And you talked a little bit about the death penalty as sort of one of those areas.
Oh, I'm so glad I don't deal with those cases anymore. As I said, I came onto the court believing I would not have to deal with them. And now I've spent 24 years dealing with the death penalty.
I've talked to some judges and justices, and some of them tell me that being a judge is a lonely profession in many ways, because you can't really talk about your cases, you can't talk to lawyers, you can't go out and play a round of golf and talk about these cases. Did you have some of those feelings when you were both on the Supreme Court and on the appeals court?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, it is a lonely job, and it should be. You've taken on a responsibility that gets its power from the fact that people believe that the system is fair. They believe that the people who are administering it are better than the usual person, that they are better trained, and that their conduct, their daily conduct should be better or exemplary. And so being a judge is very special, and you can't hang out with the lawyers that are going to appear before you. The great thing about it is the lawyers don't want you to hang out with them. A good lawyer doesn't want to be seen as buttering up to a judge. None of the government. Whenever you see that, it's some, I wouldn't say a shyster, but one of the lower level lawyers. Your best friends, when you go on the bench, who are lawyers, they get away from you just as far as they can. And it has to be that way. And you can't be speaking out on public issues and then expect people to respect your opinion when you've been out giving speeches and you promised you were going to decide the case on what occurred in the courtroom and the facts that are in the courtroom. and you've been out with no facts at all, taking a position on a matter that may come before your court. You can't do that. And your conduct has to be impeccable. I mean, you can't be
It can't
the
get you
town
for,
drunk.
for DUI, can it?
No, you shouldn't be out playing poker. If you are, you play with other judges, but you shouldn't be in a public place doing that, or gambling, or doing anything unlawful.
And you wouldn't give contributions to either political party?
Oh, no, and that's not allowed, and it shouldn't be. No.
Although some have done it.
Yes.
So your job really is to be above politics, and one of the things that's interesting to me, because it is opposite to what the public thinks. The public thinks all judges are partisan. And having talked to a lot of judges, I'm absolutely convinced that judges, by and large, there must be a few, they adhere to the law.
Exactly.
And we hear about the Florida Supreme Court 2000 was a Democratic court. They voted against Gore 4 times.
Yes.
And people somehow
they missed that.
don't remember that.
Right.
And there was a female African-American judge, whom you know, who voted against Gore when everybody assumed that, well, that case is over. We know how she's going to vote, but she judged the case on the law.
Oh, yeah. I've observed a lot of judges. Of course, I lived my last 20 years with them, and I don't know of a single instance where I could swear that I thought a judge was acting because of politics. And I've never heard one judge accuse another in a conference of acting either because of their own self-interest or for some kind of gain.
Although ideology does play a part here.
Yes. Well, the judge comes as who or she is. You're not going to take that away. That's why it's important who you put on the bench, because my background is going to influence me on some things whether I want to or not. I'm going to be a little more worried about the poor and the downtrodden than some other judges, because I can understand things that a poor person may go through. I was trying a case when I was an assistant U.S. attorney when that came clear to me. Had a witness on the stand, and they were talking about his good friend, Buddy. And he says, he was your good friend? I says, yes. The defense guy says, where does Buddy live? He says, around there by the bar. How many children does he have? I think he's got 2. You tell me you meet him up at that bar every night. You've been doing that for years. You don't know how many children? No. What's his last name? I don't know. Now, if you haven't been there, you can't believe that. That's incredible. But I can tell you all over neighborhoods where people know Buddy and they've been knowing him for 30 years, they have no idea what his last name is. They don't visit each other in their homes. And if you haven't been there, you don't know that. I can go to Jacksonville now and I says, where is Do Nasty? That's a nickname. He's around there at the pool room. Everybody knows Do Nasty. And they don't know his last name, don't care. There's a level where the kind of social interaction that the wider world sees just doesn't happen in the poor neighborhoods. It just don't happen at all.
Those are real viable cultural distinctions.
Absolutely. So when I come to the bench with that kind of a background, I can believe that testimony. Some other judge cannot believe that. They just
You don't
can't
really
see it.
know him.
That's right. That's exactly the way it goes. You don't really know it. Well, there are a lot of folks who operate that way. Do you go to church together? No.
What are the major challenges for the court system in America now?
Same ones of always. One, cost. It still takes too much to litigate. And we've pretty well taken care of the very poor. We've given them public defenders, we've given them legal aid, all kinds of things. But the middle class can hardly afford to pay for a lawsuit. So the first thing is still fighting to get costs down. The other thing is time, how long it takes to make the decision. Judges try hard, but as I used to say to my law clerks, you have to remember that there's life and there's blood and bones behind every one of those files over there. There are people whose lives are hanging on that decision. It's just not another pretty legal issue for us to play with. There's real life behind our decision, and people can't wait too long. So the time that it takes to get a case out is the thing. The other challenge is to find more ways of resolving disputes short of full litigation. We're doing fairly well in that because we now have mediation. We have court-imposed mediation. Lawyers are tired of the cost of trial and the time, so they're going into arbitration to get disputes faster and with less cost. Another challenge I've already mentioned is continuing to attract the top lawyers in communities to the bench. And compensation in state courts is getting better. Compensation in the federal courts is getting worse. And I don't know how much longer the federal courts will be able to attract the well-qualified without adequate consideration, compensation. And so those are a few of the challenges.
Are there too many frivolous suits?
Yes.
How do you restrict them?
I'm trying to do that since I've been a judge. We've ordered sanctions, and that still doesn't do it. We tell lawyers, we're going to sanction you for this frivolous case. We're going to make you pay the other side's expenses, and it just keeps happening.
In the lower courts, they can do summary judgment sometimes, can't
Sure,
they?
sure, and get out of it. We can tighten up on pleadings. You know, we have a system now that's called notice pleading. Complaint says, he wronged me, we had a contract, he broke the contract, give me $300 million. And we fill that in by discovery and get it ready for trial. Of course, many, many years ago, you had to specifically allege everything that constituted a cause of action, and there was a book that you'd have to follow that. We went to what is called notice pleading, and so it's very difficult sometimes to find out whether the case is frivolous. It's only during discovery do you find it. And even in large cities, especially in the South, lawyers still don't like to turn each other in. They don't like to ask for sanctions. I guess it's because he'll be asking for them against me tomorrow. But they don't like to do that. And therefore, the judge has to do it on his or her own. The offended party just doesn't press the judge to get sanctions against my good buddy here. But how to get rid of frivolous lawsuits, we've tried. We've got every kind of rule on the books.
Is there a problem with ethics in the legal profession? And I guess the State Bar Association polices the ethics of the state lawyers.
Florida Bar does very, very well. Very, very well. Yes.
So they can pull a license?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. I guess I've forgotten how many lawyers there are at Florida Bar now who do nothing else. The ethical standards are pretty much obeyed and followed. You know, we've got almost 80,000 lawyers, I guess, now in Florida. And there aren't that many disbarments, for example. They all come to the Florida Supreme Court. I read what the court is doing, and I don't see a large number of disbarments any larger than it was 10 years ago. And of course, the other thing that has changed in law, we have continuing legal education that includes ethics. And so the lawyers now know what's wrong. Sometimes they just didn't know what they were doing. They thought they could do something they couldn't do. Now, when a lawyer is involved in an unethical act, he or she probably knew that I can't do that. I had to tell my client about this. But continuing legal education is helping some, especially with the requirement for ethics. It's being stressed.
One of the things I believe is correct in the British legal system if you bring a frivolous suit and you lose, you pay the cost.
Yes.
Is that, that sounds a little draconian in a way, because that would prevent people from bringing suits. I don't know if that's a reasonable response to frivolous suits or not.
Well, let me address it this way. We have in the federal system what is called Rule 11. It says it talks about the frivolous lawsuit. But it makes several exceptions. It says generally, you can't file a lawsuit unless you have a reasonable belief that it is supported by the facts and by well-established law. And then there's a little catch that lets you out of that, because the law will never grow if you hold to that too stern. For example, in the Gideon case, Gideon's filed a frivolous lawsuit. The law of Florida was well established that you did not have the right to an appointed lawyer. Just as clear as day. Every case.
And that ended up in the United States Supreme Court.
The United States Supreme Court. It had been written on toilet paper.
That's right.
He filed a frivolous lawsuit. So when you talk about frivolousness, you do get into you have to consider the fact that the law has to grow. There has to be the case of first impression. And you can't cut those cases out of the system, because some of those cases are the ones that have developed every good constitutional idea we've ever had. Gideon is the best one. Frivolous lawsuit, should have been punished. Should have taken him out behind the prison. So what's frivolous? Some are, some not. What do? You know, one thing I had to do as a judge was to determine when to appoint counsel for pro se prisoners, for example. And is a prisoner who, like Gideon, who raised something, is that supposed to? I read a lot of petitions from prisoners, and then I had to appoint a lawyer to represent that fellow, because it seemed to me he's about to get onto something. Go and talk to him and see if you can develop. Maybe he didn't know he needed to allege a certain thing. So you can't be too fast when you say it's a frivolous lawsuit. The law grows by new things. And if everything just had to be already decided, you wouldn't have a frivolous lawsuit. You see, you can't decide it unless somebody else has already done it. Well, you can't do that.
Well, I think this was a Florida Supreme Court case. A prisoner was Muslim and decided he didn't want to eat the regular meals that were served in the prison. The court ruled that, well, you're in prison, too bad. And that you can't have everybody in there getting their own diet. Somebody might be a vegetarian, and you can accommodate them, but those kind of suits, although they heard that, they pretty well dismissed that. Yeah.
Well, but they didn't say it was frivolous.
No. They did hear it. Yeah.
Right, they did hear it.
What about legal advertising? How do you feel about that?
It's so well established now and been supported by the United States Supreme Court that I have to feel that it's all right under the regulations that have been established. When it first started, and before the court ruled in about 3 cases, I thought, it's awful. It's just awful. But now, the lawyers who need the business need to be able to advertise.
Since there are a lot more lawyers fighting
That's
for
right.
business,
And it hurts, for example, it hurts plaintiffs. If you cut all of that out, this person's been injured in an automobile accident, and he or she doesn't know that they can get relief. And they see on the TV screen, if you're injured, see us. Free consultation. They walk down there, they find out, I do have a case, and they get it filed. If you cut that out, you hurt that class of litigant. And let's face it, the big law firms like mine, we advertise in a different ways. We got a baseball team that we're supporting, kids Babe Ruth League, and they've got income incentive on the back. Now, we don't really have that, but the larger firms find a way to get themselves before the public. And we are usually representing defendants anyway. Big law firms are representing corporate America. It's that little guy who's just out of law school who wants to make a living, wants to help people, but no one knows that he or she exists. And so through legal advertising, that person and the plaintiff meet, and they sue folks like the big firms defend. So,
Because most people would know Holland Knight and Ackerman
sure.
and
Oh, sure.
Greenberg, Traurig. They
Yes.
would know those firms anyway.
Sure. Oh, we're going to give to the United Fund, and we're going to do all of these things.
And one thing I have to say about Chesterfield Smith, I'm sure you agree with this, he was really a strong proponent of pro bono work for all lawyers.
Absolutely. And every lawyer that joined his firm knew that they
You
were
had to
going
do
to
it.
spend some time on pro bono and some time on community activity, or they weren't going to go up the ladder. Oh, yeah, there was no question about that.
Let me talk to you about some cases, and one of the early ones was the Florida Bar versus David McCain, and you remember the details of that
Oh,
case.
yes.
Just very briefly, what he had done, he had made a phone call to two different judges trying to influence their decision. And I believe you wrote that opinion, did
Yes,
you
I
not?
did.
And came down rather strongly that he had sort of violated the whole concept of what jurists are supposed to do.
Absolutely.
Give me a little bit more about the details of that case and why you ruled the way you did.
Well, the very important question in the case was whether the Florida Bar could punish a lawyer, had jurisdiction to punish a lawyer who, while a judge, had committed unethical acts. That was a matter of first impression. Of course, to have ruled any way other than the way the court ruled would have meant that if you were a judge and you got in trouble, all you had to do was resign, and you could go back and the bar would say, we're going to punish you. And you'd say, I wasn't a lawyer at the time. I'm not a lawyer. Well, the court held there that the integrated bar included all members of the bar, and judges are members of the bar, and you can't escape discipline by resigning from the
Which he
court.
did.
Which he did. By resigning from the court, the charges will follow you back into the practice. A rather striking opinion back in those days. I don't think it would get a blink of the eye now. It's so right.
Yeah, let me read you briefly part of your decision. McCain's conduct has done much to erode the public's confidence in the integrity and impartiality of the judiciary and the bar, thus undermining the entire judicial process.
Absolutely.
Another case that I found that was really interesting is Adler versus Duval County School Board. And in this case, 11th Circuit ends up reversing Judge Hodges.
Yes.
And the case is rather fascinating because the Duval County School Board allowed the students to choose someone to give a 2-minute presentation without specifically saying what that should be. And so the school board was arguing that that's the student's choice. We're not telling them to do anything religious. We're not telling them to do a prayer. If they choose to do that, it's not the responsibility of the school board. You strongly disagreed with that point of
Yes.
view.
Well, and I disagreed based upon a verifying record that showed that the school board had been scheming all along to come up with a way of putting prayer in the schools, and that there were public meetings and there were public discussions among the commission school board members as to how to best do it. So it was a clear record that showed that they were really about prayer and not about commencement speeches. It was a matter for prayer. Now, the interesting thing about that case is that was one of my late cases. And
One of your very last ones, it was 99, wasn't it?
yes. I left the court in May of '99. The court then went en banc and reversed me. Case then went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court reversed it at the circuit. So my opinion was right according to the United States Supreme Court. But as you remember, that was a split opinion, as I recall, 2-1.
It was, yeah.
And so when I left, that was one on each side. And the whole court went in bark and in effect put prayer in the Jacksonville schools, but it didn't last long.
Well, you determined that they were trying to reverse Lee v. Weissman, which was very clearly stated no graduation prayers.
Right.
And in fact, in your opinion, the board had actually stated something. The memorandum announcing the policy was titled graduation prayers.
Exactly.
I don't know how it could be clearer than that.
No clearer. That's right. I had an excellent record. Such things as that. There's plenty of that in the record, that we're going to do prayer. How can we disguise it?
And plus, the community had been on them to get around Lee as well, in case you figure out a way to do that.
That's right. And so it was, the record was clear what was going on. There wasn't much doubt about it.
I don't understand, after Engel v. Vitale, I don't see how the 11th Circuit could say that didn't violate the Establishment Clause. I don't see, it's as clear as it could possibly be, isn't it?
Just as clear as day.
How could they go against previous Supreme Court rulings?
Well,
Do it all the time, I guess.
they tried it, but the Supreme Court straightened that out. Yeah, but we were saying whether courts are conservative or liberal or where they are, and I think you said some people say the 11th Circuit is the most conservative.
No,
I don't know about that, but there's a good example there of what I call clear Supreme Court precedent, a clear record of what was going on. But as soon as I left the court, they went in bark and chased it.
But so many cases, the Santa Fe case about the prayer at the football, I mean, there must have been.
It shouldn't have been a hard case.
Yeah, it should have been 8 or 10.
Shouldn't have been a hard case.
Another thing you do that I thought was interesting is you get a little historical background.
Yeah.
And I thought it was very interesting to note that in the First Amendment, the first thing they mention is separation of church and state, in essence. That's the very first thing, the very first amendment to the Bill of Rights. So clearly, it was very much on their minds. Now, one of the arguments they made I thought was interesting. They said, well, it only applies to a national religion being established. It really doesn't apply to states or schools or anything, which clearly has very little validity.
It should have been an easy case.
The other argument they made, you cannot in any way restrict practice of religion. Now they were saying by the Supreme Court making that decision, they were restricting their right to practice religion.
Yeah.
I mean, I thought it was some of the most convoluted arguments that I had read about.
Yes, and well, there's one worse than that I wrote. I think it's called Jaffe.
Oh yeah, I want to
Alabama case, where in effect the trial judge said the Supreme Court of the United States was wrong, just flat out wrong.
Well, and this is you're right. This is even more. This is the state of Alabama passed 2 laws.
Right.
One of them, the students had to lead.
Yes.
The teachers had to lead students in the Lord's Prayer. Right. I mean.
Yes.
And that was it. I mean, that's the only prayer they could have.
Right.
That's pretty clear cut. And the other one was, I can't remember, but there were 2 laws that were, I mean, that were clearly unconstitutional, and the I guess the Alabama Supreme Court kept ruling that it was constitutional, and that the United States Supreme Court shouldn't be telling them how to
do it. And they said, well, the United States Supreme Court has just misread history.
That's right, they said they had misread it.
They misread history. Well, but to even think that the legislature would pass 2 laws like that.
Well, it's pretty easy to start with, isn't it? The lower courts are bound by the United States Supreme Court. That is the supreme law of the land.
Absolutely.
As a start.
That's right.
I mean,
That's right.
Anything else is superfluous in a way, isn't it?
Yeah, well, but the nerve of the Alabama legislature to even pass something like that with clear precedent on the book.
Oh, yeah.
And then for the court to say, oh, the legislature's right because the U.S. Supreme Court misread history. Yeah, that was a pretty egregious case.
Let me ask you about a couple other cases. One was an interesting case, Solomon versus Liberty County Commissioners.
Right.
And in that case, it had to do, in fact, you heard a couple of cases about this, had to do with at-large, one for school district, one for county commissioners. And when they did at-large, one of the districts was something like 90% African-American.
Right.
But over a period of time, they never had anybody on the school board or the county commission.
Right.
And what was your ruling in that case?
Well, I ruled their scheme unconstitutional. And, let's see.
This would be a violation of Part 2 of the Voting Rights Act?
Voting Rights Act, yes. Yeah, I ruled it in violation of the Voting Rights Act. And I think that was the case where the county judge had a district of its own, and we ruled that they had to replace that county judge on the commission and come up with a single-member district. I've had several of those kinds of cases, voting rights cases.
And actually, when you remanded it back to the lower court, they got their own plan in effect, but what they did is they still had an at-large member,
Right.
and so you had to, had to reverse them again.
Yes, and notice that that appeal was brought by the United States. The United States the Justice Department, in other words, was objecting to the court-drawn plan. And we struck down the court-drawn plan. So that was a little extraordinary.
That's pretty unusual.
Pretty unusual, that's right. The courts are supposed to give remedies to violations, and this judge went and did the same thing that a legislature would have done, except he kind of expected of a legislature because they're trying to get an upper hand in the way they draw the plans. I've done 2 big redistricting cases. In fact, I handled a whole redistricting case for the state of Georgia last year by court appointment. And this judge drew a plan that he never should have believed was constitutional, and we told him so.
Well, it was clear what the court's order was,
Yes.
and he clearly violated it.
Clearly violated.
Now, another issue that I thought was quite interesting is McCleskey versus Kemp. This has to do with the Georgia death penalty. And essentially, this guy was a pretty bad character who had, I believe, had murdered a police officer or something like that. And in this case, I'm a little confused about the decision. You ultimately agreed with the death penalty, but you dissented because the court didn't take into consideration the fact that the law was unfairly applied to African Americans. And the African American had something like a 25% higher chance of getting a death penalty than a white.
That's right.
Explain a little bit more of exactly how you came down in terms of your opinion.
Well, the court's ruling was that a statistical difference of 6% standing alone was not enough to show disparate treatment to a constitutional certainty. I generally said, let's find out where the disparity is. A disparity of any degree is too great when you're talking about life and death. And Judge Thomas Clark, I think, joined me in that. We thought that the court should have ruled that a disparity of that amount was enough to cause a complete investigation to find out where the disparity was. How was it caused? Was it more than just the race of the victim? Or was it prosecutorial discretion, or just what was causing it? The court said, no, we're not going to go into that at all.
And what you had done, this Baldus study, a professor had gone back, he had examined thousands of cases and all these factors. He came up with a fairly strong conclusion that race was a factor.
That was it. And the court said, okay, let's assume it is. 6% is not large enough for us to worry about. It doesn't state a constitutional claim. Now, if you get 50%, maybe so. I thought that was wrong.
But you still voted to get the McCleskey the death penalty?
I think I did.
I think that's right.
I think it did, yes.
In other words, in terms of his case,
Right.
it was sufficient for the death penalty.
That's
You were
right.
just trying to, and later on, the courts are going to start considering that.
Yes.
As time goes on, that's going to be a more significant factor than had been the case in the past.
Yes, in fact, it appears to me that the United States Supreme Court is making the death penalty so difficult to manage and to carry out death, the penalty, that the states are going to be turning away from it. You almost have to be a specialist in that area now to even deal with the cases coming out of the Supreme Court. They're narrowing the class of people who can be executed so much that the states may not be able to continue it. And we may not want to continue it, you know. We talk about the great majority want it, but we don't know that. Nobody's voted on whether that's true or not.
I was interested to learn that loggerhead turtles can sue.
Yeah.
That was an interesting case. I think that wasn't that Daytona or Volusia County?
Volusia County.
And what was happening is the turtles were impacted by the lighting and the riding of cars on the beach, and that those lights would turn them around, and ultimately they would either be run over or perish.
Right.
And so how did the court happen to get into that case?
Well, it came to us, and we couldn't say, go home. And by the way, that case is still pending.
Is it really?
Yes. And I'm kidding one of the judges that I saw about he's now the loggerhead person. It's a great environmental case.
And this would be Endangered Species Act?
No.
No.
It's the act, the name of the act is in the opinion. I've forgotten the name of the act. But it came along when environmental cases were not as popular as they are now. And it was a good opportunity for the court to speak on that question as to the rights of, well, I guess it is endangered species.
It is Endangered Species Act,
It is endangered species, sure it is. And that was a tough case.
And that's a case of first impression, obviously.
Very much so. Very much so. That's about the first impression you can get. But it's important. For example, if you go down to Naples and in that area of Florida and you're living in a motel facing the ocean, your blinds are closed. You have to keep your blinds closed. And if you open your blinds at night during nesting season, the front desk will call you and tell you, please close your blinds. It's very bad for the turtles. Now, of course, I lived in Daytona Beach. I started practice there. And I have seen the turtles come out of the ocean and go up into the hills. And people come out with poles and beat the birds away and all of the predators until
And they protect them.
so they're protected. And so I had seen the beaches and had been on the beaches down there. I didn't make the decision because of that. But right now, I think the turtles are protected during nesting season. But the general litigation is still going on over that whole matter of the turtles and the beaches and the public using the beaches, and it's still going on, that's all I know.
Did you deal with many other environmental cases?
No. I remember having some very important clean air cases. I think all of us see clean air more than anything else because, for example, I've been involved with big electrical companies. Up in Alabama, that's when I was on the bench, and since I've been off. Environmental clean air is the big thing that you see. You don't see many turtle cases, but a lot of the old electric plants are burning that old oil. And quite frankly, they were sued during this is after I left the bench. These big companies were sued by the Environmental Protection Agency during the Carter administration.
No.
I'm sorry, during the Clinton administration.
No longer.
No longer. The Bush came in, the whole policy changed, and they're still out there burning.
An interesting case also was Swint v. Pullman Standard.
Yes.
This was on when you're on the Fifth Circuit. Had to do with seniority, and African Americans, of course, under the seniority system were obviously not getting promoted, not getting the kind of jobs,
Right.
pay raises. And the argument you made that in effect, by perpetuating a seniority system that existed previously, amounted to racial discrimination.
That's right.
Explain a little bit more of how they did that and why you ruled the way you did.
This is an early case, and so it was a very important case. And you'll note that there are unions involved in this case. And everybody, Voting Rights Act and the Title VII case, early after Title VII. And what the company did, we said, well, you're going to have to desegregate and no longer discriminate in employment. They said, okay. But then they just left everyone where they were. Well, no supervisors, they didn't have any black supervisors. So they just left them where they were. They said, okay, now from now on, we'll start putting you into the system. Well, that's discrimination. You've got to go back and say where they should have been and put them where they should have been. And that's why that comes out to be an important case, because it told other companies all over the Fifth Circuit at least that you can't just say we've ended discrimination in employment and we're going to keep the same seniority system.
Well,
Because obviously you have to move people where they should have been.
This is right, correct me if I'm wrong, that if you moved to another job, you lost your seniority.
Yes,
So
right.
they started moving the African Americans to a different job.
Yes. So they
I mean,
wouldn't
that's
have-
pretty blatant there.
So they wouldn't have seniority.
Yeah,
Oh, yes,
but-
yes, it's a big case.
That's clear cut,
Yeah,
it seemed to
yeah.
me.
Yeah, but we had to put it on the books, and so the other companies would not follow that practice.
Well, it's obvious that people have a lot of different legal escapes or
Yes.
rationalizations to
Right.
do what they're doing and trying to get around the law.
Sure.
And-
All
and-
the time.
And your job's obviously to detect that
That's right.
and call them on it.
Yeah, they got relief, but in effect, there was no relief at all. They just kept a job. They didn't get everything that goes with having a job.
Are there some other cases that are important to you that we can talk about? I know you've got to leave in just a few minutes.
Yeah.
Anything else that would be of great significance in your judicial career you'd like to talk about? Well, I mean, I've got more cases we could go on and on and on, but maybe there's some that stand out in your mind.
No, I think you hit the big ones.
Let me ask your opinion of the United States Supreme Court decision in Bush v. Gore.
Well, I don't think the United States Supreme Court really understood the Florida recount law. I think the Supreme Court, number one, thought that they were dealing with a problem that no one had thought of. We've had recount challenges in Florida for year after year after year. And the Florida Supreme Court was following that procedure to the letter. And their criticism of the Florida Supreme Court, I think, was just plain wrong. I don't think they had any jurisdiction in the case at all. I don't think they had any jurisdiction.
Interesting, because the Rehnquist Court had talked about states' rights and rarely made decisions based on the 14th Amendment.
Exactly. And I thought they thought a national crisis was happening. And we all know now that if they had let the Florida Supreme Court process work out, and then it had gone into the legislature, would have followed a course that had been right on paper for years.
There's a constitutional basis for resolving these issues.
Yes, it was all there. But they jumped in early, and they didn't think they had as much time as they had, I don't think. But I disagree with them. I mean, I don't care who should have been the winner. But to snatch the case, as I said, from the Florida Supreme Court, when the Florida Supreme Court was following Florida law, I think was wrong.
I thought it was also interesting that they did not allow the recount to be completed.
That's right.
I've talked to the judge in that case, and he said it would have been complete, partly because the judges were doing it, not these partisan counts.
Yes, they thought there was a crisis when there was. They didn't think they had enough time.
Well, they made the decision at 11:30, and you had a half hour.
Yeah, yeah. It's. I don't know how you decide an election case without counting the votes. How do you do that? Now, you may have to ask this Chad, is this a good one or a bad one? But I don't care. You've got to count.
Well, but that's what they have, election supervisor and the boards who do the counting. That's their job.
Yeah, stopping the recount was very bad.
If
I
you
read Dershowitz's book about it, and he followed it closer than I did.
Who was that?
Dershowitz at Harvard.
Yeah, Alan Dershowitz, yeah.
Alan, yes. And he makes a very strong case that the Supreme Court, number one, acted too quickly.
Well, he said they were actually engaging in criminal behavior. That's how strong his statement was.
Well, and
I thought that was a little over the top. But
some justices should have recused.
O'Connor, for one.
Yeah, but anyway.
Well, and of course, this has no precedential value, as they say, in just this case. But if you look at the 67 counties in Florida, every county had a different machine, a different way of counting, different races, different ballots, all of them were different.
Everything.
It's always been that way.
Sure.
If you determine that somehow is unconstitutional, every election in America is unconstitutional because other states had punch card ballots.
Sure.
I mean, how can you make such a broad-based decision? Although there were some irregularities, if you look at the difference between Palm Beach and Miami and how many votes counted, and in Broward County you had a higher chance, but that's always the way it's been.
Sure. Yeah, I don't think the Supreme Court understood that.
I don't think they do.
Recounting for years.
Well,
now.
you know, Don Middlebrooks in the early decision said, this is the way it is, it's no business of the United States Supreme Court.
No, I don't think they had any jurisdiction either. But here's the great thing about it all. We are still here. We didn't have a civil war. We didn't have people in the streets but for a little while, and not many then. The system worked, whether they were right or wrong. We went on, we have a president, we're doing well. And that's all because the people believe in the system. And we don't have to send troops around to keep people out of the streets when they think it's a bad decision. The nation lived through it. And that's a great pat on the back for the American people, because they do respect the rule of law and abide by it when they think it's wrong.
Yeah, once that decision was made, that was it.
That was it.
Some people have argued that it was the right decision, but not very well constitutionally argued. You know, it was more of a pragmatic decision than a constitutional
well,
decision.
I know Dershowitz
That's what
his
he-
book obviously says that.
Yeah.
I don't know about that. I disagreed with it. But again, the country survived. And the American people ought to be congratulated for that.
How would you like to be remembered in terms of your judicial career?
Judge who did the best he could.
How about all of your firsts?
They were important, not so much for me. They're important in advancing the integration of the whole society, American society, and to drive us away from the stereotypes and all of the things that had led to some belief that has been expressed in law that African Americans were not able to participate fully in government for all kinds of reasons, including lack of intelligence. And so it meant a lot for all Americans, because getting away from segregation, getting away from ideas about people being deficient because of their race or color. The more we get away from that, the better. And so my first helped do that. For example, I said there were only 25 black lawyers in this state when I started. Well, I don't even know how many black lawyers there are in Tallahassee today. I don't even know how many are up there on the hill. I go up there, there must be every office you see. And there was a time when I knew every black lawyer and every black judge for sure in the state. I don't know them anymore. That's very good. And so we've come a long, long way.
And people like Virgil Hawkins opened the door for people
absolutely.
going to law school. And as I recall, maybe this is wrong, I thought this was kind of extraordinary. At the last part of his appeal, he said he would drop his appeal if Judge Devane would open the graduate schools in Florida to admit African Americans.
Yes.
That was a pretty strong sentiment on his part. After 9 years of all these appeals, he says, okay, I'll give up. And so he made, and his ability to challenge the law and your achievements opened the door for people like Stephen Mickle,
Sure.
who got into law school partly because of Virgil Hawkins,
Sure.
and I think probably got to the court
Right.
because you had demonstrated that you could be successful. So
Well, I hope so.
I think that's pretty important achievement. It's a path-breaking change in how people perceive African Americans in the law.
Well, I hope that all of this, and that somehow I've helped bring about change. Yeah, I sure hope so. But you mentioned Judge Devane. As I recall, that's when the Supreme Court sent the Hawkins case back to this federal judge. I wonder what would have happened if the Supreme Court had believed that they had a president like Eisenhower was that would enforce their order, and he'd come down and enforce that order. You know,
Like you did in Little Rock.
had a court opinion, and he said, I'm going to take the troops down to Little Rock, and we're going to enforce it. Sending that case to Judge Devane, I've never quite figured out what they expected him to do. And why didn't they simply say, we're the highest court in the country, executive branch, enforce our order, and maybe it would have been over with.
And he was known as a segregationist judge.
Yes.
I mean, I don't think there's any question about that.
Well, back in those days, the Supreme Court probably didn't know what to do. How do we get out of this argument with this state? How do we get out of that?
I think just wanted to remand it back to them, let them figure it out, I
Yes.
guess.
Yes.
Which is,
Well, we'll send it over to a federal judge. So they probably were right. They probably did not have a president who would take their court order and enforce it the way
not
President
then.
Eisenhower did.
Yeah, not at that time.
That's right. So they didn't know what to do, I would guess. And they put it back to this federal judge down there, and I guess said, work it out with them somehow. But I always wondered what would have happened if that order had been enforced.
Is there anything that we haven't talked about that you'd like to talk about? Any issues, cases, remembrances, anything?
No, I think we've covered it.
Okay.
I think we've covered it.
Well, on that note, I want to thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for coming over and doing it.
Before we sign off, I wanted to ask you about some of the people that you work with and respected over the years.
Well, as you know, most of my practice and most of my time on course was spent in the Middle District of Florida. I was born in Clearwater, Florida, and I was educated in the schools there. And during the course of my practice, I met some very fine judges. For example, one was Chief Judge George Young in Orlando, Judge Charles Scott in Jacksonville. I've already mentioned two United States attorneys, John Briggs and Eddie Boardman. And these were all people that I modeled myself after, and people who mentored me and helped me get from one place to the other in terms of my rise through the judiciary. Judge Gerald Schoflat that I found is
Who's on the 11th Circuit.
On the 11th Circuit, who was chief judge there before I was chief. had a lot to do with my advancement in the judiciary, and well, all of these people were very close friends and people that I respected. Thank you.
Okay, well, we'll end on that note. Thank you.